This is a story about a magical world filled with a wide variety of monsters, from insidious goblins to unknown creatures. The goblins were as numerous as ants and attacked in a crowd, but there were those who had no trouble dealing with them, no matter how many there were. The goblins were cunning and always tried to outsmart their opponents. However, one day they came across a young man against whom their tricks did not work. But the monsters did not give up, despite the fact that most of their comrades had already been killed. Even their sudden attacks with bows were of no avail. Yuan was a brave warrior. At first glance, he looked like an ordinary boy, but his skill level was quite high. Using Bangmang, his strongest weapon that resembled a bat, he transformed it into something more. Now it was a real automatic rifle filled with magic. This is what happens when you underestimate your opponent based only on appearances. The young man was not always so strong, but from early childhood he showed extraordinary abilities. At the age of 4, he could already read books without difficulty, which delighted his parents. They were even more amazed that the boy began to read in the languages of countries that no one in the family had even heard of. Then grandfather ran into the room and announced that Yuan had inherited a rich lineage of ancestors. Finally, he said, a child had been born who would fulfill a long-held family dream, to return the Tower of Babel to the possession of their family. The rest of the family were skeptical, thinking that their grandfather was simply delirious in his old age. However, he was confident in his words and wanted to show something to Yuan. He told the boy a story about a great ancestor of the Ban family who once performed a real miracle. Possessing the ability to understand one another, he led the people and built a tower that would never collapse, the very same Tower of Babel. The first thing that came to the young man's mind was wealth. Could their ancestor really have owned this legendary tower? But the grandfather explained that the ancestor was merely a master linguist, capable of translating and transforming any language, and that the family should not forget what a great man he was. He convinced Yuan that once their family found the tower again, they would regain their former glory and power. These words lit a spark in the boy's eyes. As a young boy, Yuan often listened to his grandfather's stories about his ancestors' adventures, and his grandfather hoped that his extraordinary talent for languages would help the boy realize the family dream. However, Yuan's abilities exceeded all expectations, and one day a miracle happened. Now, Yuan is just a high school applicant, but thanks to his academic performance, he was hoping to enter a prestigious university, namely to the Faculty of Political Science and Diplomacy at the University of S. But he was beginning to worry that the results of his admission were taking a long time to be announced. Suddenly, something strange appeared on the laptop screen. Yuan didn't understand what was happening. An unknown letter appeared in front of him, which was difficult to read. The text was distorted and written in a language Yuan had never seen before. It seemed to announce his admission to the best academy in the alternate reality and the acceptance of his documents. Yuan didn't understand what kind of academy this was. He definitely hadn't applied there. Meanwhile, a timer appeared on the screen, counting down to the practical assessment. The young man decided that this was probably some kind of trick by his sister, Banyumi. The distorted letter disappeared, and a message about successful enrollment appeared on the screen. Yuan was so overjoyed that he completely forgot about the strange letter, thinking it was just nerves. But the countdown was already drawing to a close. Yumi entered the room to see if he had been admitted. But when she opened the door, she found no one there. Meanwhile, Yuan had already been teleported to the location where the practical assessment for candidates from the lower dimensions was taking place. Looking around, he realized this wasn't a game at all. He had actually been summoned to the academy. His mission was to defeat the blind goblin and destroy the dungeon's core. The young man didn't understand what practical assessment was being discussed, since he hadn't applied anywhere. But the test had already begun. Blind goblins came running at his screams, and the young man was terrified by their appearance. Since the goblins were blind, they relied solely on hearing and smell. Yuan realized that now was not the time to be confused. His life was in danger. And yet he didn't fully understand whether he really needed to fight the goblins to get out of here. My head hurt a little after the fall, and the surrounding environment only increased my fear. He began to think about how to defeat the two monsters in order to pass the exam. While he was trying to figure out what to do, he accidentally made a couple of extra sounds. This was a big mistake. One of the goblins immediately rushed at him. Yuan realized his mistake and tried to remain as quiet as possible. The goblins continued to rummage around in search of prey, reacting to the slightest sound. The young man tried to remain calm but accidentally hit the rocks and made noise again. A blind goblin immediately pounced on him, and it seemed that the end had come for the boy. But at the last moment, he managed to dodge the monster's blow. Although he managed to evade them, the goblins did not leave him alone and continued their search. Then he realized that, despite their blindness, their senses of hearing and smell were much sharper. Moreover, they hunted together, driving the prey. And no matter how well he hid, he would still be found sooner or later. If he doesn't want to die so stupidly, he needs to come up with something urgently. The only way out is to use their power against them. Yuan picked up a few stones and threw them away from himself. As expected, the goblins immediately rushed towards the sound, thinking that the victim was running away. One of them, having reached the place, realized that these were just stones and was slightly surprised. Meanwhile, the young man picked up a larger stone and threw it straight at the monster. It would not have been possible to knock out, much less kill, the goblin in this way, but it made the monster even more aggressive. One of the goblins thought that the blow came from behind, turned around and immediately struck back. Only it wasn't Yuan who was there, but his comrade. The goblins didn't even realize they were fighting each other, believing that they had prey in front of them. In the end, Yuan managed to defeat them. Completely weakened, they fell to the floor, covering each other with their bodies. However, the young man noticed that one of the monsters continued to breathe, although it could not escape from under the body of its comrade. So Yuan had to deal with him himself. Despite his fear, he managed to finish off the goblin because if he hesitated and couldn't finish off even this dying creature, he wouldn't escape the dungeon. After this, something strange began to happen around him. A distorted letter appeared in front of him, which stated that the first stage had been successfully completed. As a reward for his courage, Yuan receives the power of the upper dimension, and from now on he has access to the Babylonian Codex. The power of the Babylonian code has been activated. It will now be transmitted through the ideograms of the language, that is, symbols that convey meaning through their form. Hieroglyphs were also registered. Unlike phonetic symbols, which represent sounds, these symbols convey concepts directly through their form. The common concept of the two goblins, demon and life, was removed. Now the young man can extract and absorb the concepts of his opponents, depending on their level. Yuan's abilities are not limited to just knowing languages. He can now become stronger at the expense of those he defeats. He managed to absorb 0.2 demons. Since such concepts are beyond human understanding, it is recommended to store them in the Babylonian Codex and apply them to other objects. Yuan now has a choice: save the concept for later or apply it immediately, for example, on himself. The young man decided to try it on himself. He absorbed 0.4 life, after which he increased his life to 10.4. His overall abilities and potential have improved significantly. By absorbing 0.2 flesh, Yuan's strength increased to 10.2, making his body stronger and healthier. It wasn't just a feeling. His grip, his legs, his skin, everything else had definitely strengthened. And all this is thanks to the fact that he absorbed the concepts of just two goblins with the help of removal and absorption. After this, their bodies disappeared, leaving behind only clubs. Since the act of applying the concepts worked on him, it would work on other objects as well. For example, on the Goblin's Club. Using the unlocked power, Yuan quickly cleared the blind goblin dungeon. He also found the dungeon core and destroyed it. With this, his special practical test was completed, and the young man thought that he could finally return home. However, the place where he was moved was not his home at all. It turned out to be the academy dormitory. Yuan found himself in a world he had never seen before, a place called the Union Academy. After passing the exam, he received the status of a temporary student, but he was more interested in where he was. He received a letter asking him to put on the provided uniform and then come for an interview. Yuan still didn't understand what was happening. He'd just taken the entrance exams, and now he had to wear the school uniform again. The young man was unhappy with this turn of events. After all, he had just found himself on the brink of death, and now they wanted to interview him. And yet he agreed, intending to say everything he thought about it. At the very least, Yuan planned to demand compensation for such impudence. But his indignation immediately vanished when he saw the professor, who seemed attractive to him at first sight. She had green skin and was clearly not human. Yuan was surprised and thought she was an alien. She introduced herself as Yumina, the professor of magical combat at the United Academy, and was glad to meet the young man. She also congratulated him on successfully passing the practical exam, adding that the entire faculty had been watching him. Yuan wasn't particularly happy about this news. Yumina informed him that he had become the first student in 500 years to create a new artifact during an exam. The young man did not share her delight. After all, he had been brought here without his knowledge. He did not understand anything and almost died. Perhaps it was because they were from different worlds and had different ways of thinking. Yuan had no intention of staying and planned to leave immediately after the interview, or so he thought, until he saw something that made him change his mind. There was a huge column in front of him, and he asked the professor what it was called. Yumina replied that she'd heard that people from the lower dimensions knew nothing about the unification and this pillar, and it turned out to be true. She then added that this pillar was the reason the academy was created. The academy nurtures students with exceptional talents from all dimensions and helps them reach the summit of the tower. This is the aspiration of the United Academy and the last hope of all worlds. This was the very same Tower of Babel, a dungeon among dungeons, which is the source of all the secrets and dangers of this world. Yuan was delighted. Could all the stories his grandfather told him as a child really be true? Everything he talked about was right here. However, Yumina warned that the tower was the dungeon of all dungeons, and most likely already overrun with monsters. But it didn't matter. Yuan was determined to restore the family to its former glory. It was then that he decided to enroll in the United Academy. Thanks to the professor's special treatment, he was temporarily sent back home. There, Yuan gathered the entire family and told them what had happened. His grandfather was simply delighted, and the young man now had the opportunity to prepare for university entrance exams. To do this, he went to the lower dungeon of the association, the Hobgoblin Cave. There, his training began. He easily dealt with all the goblins that stood in his way. He finally managed to discover something new within himself. Until then, he had only used his linguistic abilities. But now everything had changed. Thanks to the Babylonian Codex, he could verbalize, absorb, and manipulate the concepts of objects. By defeating an enemy, Yuan is able to recognize and master their concept. And the more concepts he collects, the stronger he becomes. He put the concept he had received in the first dungeon, from the blind goblins, into the club he had received. He strengthened it and turned it into a weapon, which now became his main weapon. This is no longer just a club, but the formidable bat, a mace imbued with ghostly energy, and the first artifact created by Yuan. It is capable of revealing its true form at the owner's command, transforming and acting independently as an autonomous artifact. Because he created this artifact by accident, he received a good result in the evaluation. Among the concepts obtained from the monsters was something Yuan had never encountered before: a soul. Suddenly, the mace began to swing from side to side, as if saying, "I want this." Along with the soul, Yuan decided to convey a little more life, as well as the concepts of ghost and spirit. By acquiring even the most insignificant concepts, the young man used them to saturate the mace. He didn't fully understand what would happen when he imparted these concepts to her, but that only made things more interesting. The concepts, united in perfect harmony, caused the transformation of the artifact. The concepts of Ghost 2.5 and Beast 4 automatically merged. Their perfect synergy led to a fusion that went beyond ordinary existence. Yuan was surprised to see the Beast concept. Could one of the concepts he left behind actually transform on its own? Through transcendental fusion, the concept of Ghost Beast 10 was completed. By combining the symbols of a ghost and a beast, the young man obtained a ghost beast. Her personality remained the same, and the young man wondered if she could still transform into a magical cannon or shield. From now on, this ghostly beast would be called Eva. And before returning, Yuan decided to test his characteristics. They had grown noticeably since last time. Flesh seemed to reflect physical stats, but Yuan was more interested in why the soul stat was so high compared to the others. He also gained the abilities All-Seeing Eye, Perfect Pitch, and Mouth of Babel, which may have been related to his linguistic skills. It was also interesting to see whether Eva would be able to surprise anyone, but it seemed she was sure of the opposite. It's time to leave the dungeon and return to the academy. Yuan was steadily improving his stats. The main thing was to keep up the pace. And now, the most important event was the entrance ceremony to the United Academy. The ceremony was to take place in a special auditorium at the academy, designated exclusively for admissions. Other students gradually filled the hall, taking their seats while they waited for it to begin. Yuan's sudden appearance surprised the students standing nearby. Yuan himself was also amazed to see how many people came to the ceremony. He activated the All-Seeing Eyes, which allowed him to read auras and spirits, and the higher their level became, the deeper the owner could understand the surroundings. As the young man had expected, unlike him, who had passed through a special quota for the lower dimensions. The regular students who passed the regular selection looked very strong, even at first glance. While Yuan was looking around for a place, a couple of students had already approached him. He was the very type of person who belittles others because of their origins. In his case, because he belonged to a lower dimension. Yuan didn't want any trouble, so he decided to quickly move away. As he thought, those who passed the regular selection had a very high opinion of themselves. Even here, powerful and influential students looked down on those below them. Suddenly, someone called out Yuan's name and said that the special selection students were in another place. The phrase special selection students sounded respectable, but felt more like isolation. Yuan was surprised that all these guys were actually from the lower dimensions, just like him. However, their characteristics and abilities were far superior to his own. Each of them was not just taller than him, but superior to him by several heads. Compared to them, only Yuan truly looked like a representative of the lower dimensions. They were at such a level that they could single-handedly deal with the regular selection students. Among them was S-Light, his roommate, who really did look like he was studying light. S-Light was surprised when Yuan called their place amazing. They had already met in the dorm before Yuan arrived at the ceremony, and their first meeting was a little awkward. At first, S-Light mistook him for an enemy, not realizing that he was facing a first-year student and his neighbor. He immediately apologized, citing nerves after the practical exam. At first glance, S-Light looked like a prince from a fairy tale, but he turned out to be quite hot-tempered. Yuan told him about his exam, which amused him greatly. After all, even a novice with only the basics could have handled the goblins. S-Light himself had to deal with a group of trolls and ogres. Yuan noted that he hadn't spoken to anyone so casually in a long time. After all, they met right after the exam, without even having time to take a shower. Therefore, the young man wanted to go to the shower as soon as possible. Even though the shower was shared, S-Light still decided to continue the conversation right there. Yuan seemed to have a slight feeling of awkwardness after this meeting. And since these seats were reserved specifically for specially selected students, it meant that the two girls sitting next to S-Light were also from his group. Yuan greeted them. One of the girls looked like the embodiment of kindness and sweetness. Her name was Rushel. The second was more reserved, and the first thing that caught her attention was the snake coiled around Yuan's arm. Despite Eva being invisible, she was able to see it. Yuan introduced Eva to his new acquaintances. They were surprised to see her, but the young man was still wondering how they managed to do it. S-Light wondered if this was the same artifact he had before, and how he was able to change it so quickly in just a couple of days. Despite the cool reception, the girl became interested in Yuan and introduced herself as Dak Goyen, the daughter of Master Murim. Yuan also introduced himself and asked her about Master Murim. Apparently, she uses martial arts and creates gusts of wind between her palms. The young man was too straightforward in his statements, which slightly amused the others. Dak Goyen replied that he was absolutely right. She really did do that. In the distance, Yuan also noticed Yumina sitting among the other professors. S-Light asked if he really had an interview with the professor. Yuan replied that he had, and for some reason he thought S-Light had too. But suddenly something began to happen above them. The ceiling of the auditorium slowly opened up. Some strange pressure appeared, which caused the students to have headaches. None of them could withstand this incomprehensible pressure. At this time, a voice was heard that announced that the ceremony was ready. Yuan looked up and saw something strange that shocked him. It was like a giant eye that announced the beginning of the 2557th opening ceremony of the United Academy. After the ceremony, Yuan and the others gathered in Yumina's office. She wondered if the students had been impressed by the principal's speech. But for most students, this caused more fear than pleasant surprise. Yuan replied that it was unbelievable and asked if that giant eye was the principal. His words shocked everyone, as many were too scared to even look up. Dak Goyen looked at Yuan with apprehension after that. It seemed to her that he was not a student at all, but some kind of creature hidden under a special ability. But Yuan continued that at least it felt like a huge eye was looking at them. Yumina confirmed that it was indeed the rector, and they would likely not see him again unless they achieved something exceptional or provoked an incident. However, it seemed that Yuan was about to have a personal meeting with the rector, although for him it felt more like a curse. Yumina added that her students' achievements were also her achievements as a professor. These words surprised S-Light. He asked Yumina if she would be their leader, to which she replied in the affirmative. S-Light was surprised because They would be led by one of only 9 professors in the entire academy. The professor formally introduced herself as Yumina and explained that she taught magical combat. Easelight asked if students weren't usually assigned lower-level mentors. Yumina replied that this was true, but that this year the students admitted were so unusual that the responsibility was placed on her. So unusual, it's a wonder they were even chosen. The professor warned them to be careful about envy and hostility from the regular students. Yuan was surprised by her words because the envy and hostility here went beyond ordinary rivalry. The discussion was about real clashes and fights, in which even professors have no right to interfere. Yumina added that from now on, the 4 of them should stick together, as they are rare special selection students. To thrive among others, they must be strong enough to ignore others' envy and hostility. And with that, they are now partners who will have to climb the tower until the end of their training. Yumina then thanked them and informed them that the academy had prepared small gifts for them. She will explain the rules and other details after they receive the artifacts. The artifact was so bright that it was impossible to look away. This pendant was a kind of student card that students were required to carry with them. With its help, they could identify themselves, gain access to all campus facilities, and even teleport around the territory of the association. The teleportation spell actually worked, and Eslight and Rushel were delighted with the professor. Dokgoyon, on the contrary, did not show such emotionality. The ticket was also needed to enter the tower, so the pendant had to be carefully watched. Rushel was curious why the others left while Yuan stayed. Dokgoyon guessed that perhaps it was because he was the only one who sensed the presence of the eye. Just before the tea party, Yumine received a call about this. Dokgoyon immediately realized that something was wrong because only Yuan was able to look directly at the principal. Meanwhile, Yuan sat in the office, overcome with excitement. A personal meeting with the rector on the very first day. What did he manage to do? Suddenly, a voice began to come from the doll standing opposite. He said that the young man could look at him calmly because his true incarnation was not here. The rector asked to be called Master and explained why he had summoned the young man. He usually does not interfere with the student's education. The weak remain weak, the strong remain strong. Their lives depend only on them. Whether they die in the tower or achieve power and glory, the master does not care. Yuan tensed up as he listened to the rector's monologue and didn't quite understand what he was talking about. The master explained that his only goal was to see who could reach the summit. Everything else was of no importance to him. He spoke of the Tower of Babel, which the Ban family has been intending to reclaim since ancient times, along with all its power and glory. But Yuan is willing to risk his life to get the tower back. However, the master reminded him that the tower had different meanings for the other students, and each one had his own way of trying to climb to the top. So the young man asked the master what the tower was. He replied that the tower was a test on the path to the divine. Hearing this, Yuan began to worry. What kind of deity was at the top of it? By deity, he meant something like glory and dictatorship, where everyone bows down to one master. Yuan was excited, but he was even more curious about what was hidden at the top of the tower. The master continued that he usually does not interfere with students' difficulties, but this time he will make an exception, because I saw potential in the young man, the greatest I had ever seen. He promised to take measures to help Yuan climb to the top of the tower. Something strange began to happen to the young man's pendant, and it frightened him. But the master reassured him, saying everything was fine. He'd simply expanded his research rights beyond the academy's boundaries. Now he could venture into any dungeon. Yuan now has even more opportunities to hone his skills before climbing the tower. The master thanked the young student and sent him on his way, wishing him good luck. He added that the boy needed to improve his skills, and if his progress was noticeable, he would unlock the next privilege for him. Yuan wasn't quite sure what kind of privilege he was talking about. The master explained that he would allow him to explore the tower alone. Yuan was surprised to hear this. In the end, he added that he would look forward to their next meeting. Emerging from the portal, he accidentally bumped into the professor. She merely smiled and said it was fine. The rector always dismissed guests this way. Yuan told her about the conversation. The professor was surprised to learn that the master had given him permission to leave the academy. The young student didn't understand whether this was really so important, to which the professor replied that not everyone is allowed to do this. Now he could freely explore the outer dungeons and visit the outer cities at will. This meant that he would receive much more experience and training than other students. Yuan thought that the master gave him this opportunity because he considered him too weak, so the privilege was akin to extra classes. Yumina even envied Yuan a little, because professors are usually so busy that they can't leave the academy at this time. She added that the association is an academy where everything is organized in the interests of students, which is sometimes inconvenient for teachers. He could wander around the shops and enjoy the local delicacies as much as he wanted. Yumina advised him of one good outer city, Ronica. So the young man set off there. The professor asked him to bring 2 bottles of wine for the newlyweds, made by the temple priests, a drink renowned for its sweet, fruity aroma, rich bubbles, and lingering aftertaste. Yuan couldn't refuse her, and he himself wasn't against it, because there was certainly something interesting to be found in the city. In addition, as a reward for this, he received an expanded inventory. Yuan remembered one of the items his grandfather left him before he entered university. The young man became interested in what kind of consumables his grandfather had prepared for him. He gave the bag to me just before leaving, saying that it contained something he would soon need. The bag was so heavy that it felt like it contained bricks rather than anything useful, and it turned out to be close to the truth. There were bars of pure gold inside. Grandfather said the young man could take as much as he wanted. After all, it was the legacy of his ancestors who had dedicated themselves to finding the Tower of Babel. Now it all belonged to him. Thanks to the inventory, carrying them with you was not difficult. The grandfather also reminded that gold is valuable in any world, and the time had come for the young man to go to a new world. The city of Ronica truly looked stunning. Even though it was another dimension, the cityscape felt familiar. While Yuan was admiring the streets, guards approached him and asked where he was from, as they had never seen him there before. As they got closer, they noticed he was wearing a student uniform and realized he was from the United Academy. They greeted him warmly and introduced themselves as guards of the western border of the Ronica academic town. They were curious whether the rector himself had given him permission. Yuan confirmed that this was indeed the case. The master had given him permission to explore the area freely. They added that thanks to the hard work of the master and the academy staff, their city still remains peaceful, and they are grateful for that. The guards offered their help if the young man wanted to get used to the city. Without thinking twice, Yuan raised his hand, pointed at one of the flying machines, and said that he would like to get his hands on one. He became interested in how much it cost, although it was not that important. His ancestors left him enough money. Thanks to his inheritance, acquiring a hover bike was no problem for him. Emotions were off the charts. The young man had not been able to feel this happy for a long time. Even the basic version of the bike cost 250,000 roni, expensive, but not for Yuan. The guards were surprised when the young man pulled out a gold bar and offered to exchange it for a hover bike. The exchange was far from equal. 1 bar of gold was worth 7.5 million roni. All this time Eva was with him, and she apparently was also interested in flying on a bike. Yuan added the concept of spirit and ghost to it, turning the hover bike into a living artifact. The young man named the new artifact Lilith, endowing it with a will, just like Eve. He also bought some wine for the professor, so it was time to return to the academy. But the joy did not last long. The professor invited him to have a drink together. S-Light was disappointed in Yuan because after their meeting he left without saying a word. In addition, Yuan came back with a hangover, which made S-Light even more angry. The young man admitted that he was truly sorry, but he could not refuse the professor. Furthermore, Yuan was now the class representative. Doc Goyen joked that he received the representative symbol in exchange for becoming the professor's drinking buddy. But the young man wasn't against this either. S-Light, though reluctantly, accepted it. Doc Goyen, however, was against this decision and believed that she should be the head woman, because she is the strongest among them. Doc Goyen was confident that she was stronger than even Yuan. S-Light was dissatisfied with Doc Goyen's words and considered them a strange way of expressing thoughts. After all, they should be equal comrades. He wanted to hear an explanation from her, because her attitude as if she were above everyone else was unlikely to have a good effect on their joint adventures in the tower. But Dakoyan didn't agree with S-Light. In fact, she even found it amusing. It was funny for her to hear about equal comrades from the one who asked the professor yesterday whether students could conquer the tower alone. S-Light replied that he was just curious, which didn't mean he didn't want to go to the tower with the others. It looks like they're getting into that hostility mode, and Yuan was going to say this morning that they should at least come up with a plan in advance, but it looks like the group is already off to a rough start. In particular, Yuan didn't want to be the class president, but now he began to understand why Yumina chose him out of the 4 of them. S-Light is surprisingly ignorant, but his pride is ridiculously strong. Doc Goyan is incredibly self-centered, strong, but will definitely make enemies. And Russell is surprisingly passive. She doesn't have the character to lead or educate others. Therefore, Yuan was the best candidate among the others. And since he's the class president, it's time to take matters into his own hands. Yuan says the class president doesn't necessarily have to be the strongest, since he's responsible for other things. But Dokoyan did not agree with his words. In her opinion, the headman should still be the strongest. Yuan believes that since the strongest is the class president, they will make all decisions independently at their own discretion. A class president must be able to offer a fair and good solution for everyone. In this sense, they are the most flexible. Doc Goyen decided to back down, since it was the professor who had the right to appoint the class monitor, as long as she agreed with their arguments. Although the only person she wanted to lead was Yuan, these words made the young man tense. Doc Goyen added that even if something is bothering her, if she wants to get what she wants, she will have to put up with what she doesn't need. By doing this, she further inflamed the internal conflict in the class. Doc Goyen left, and her last words deeply hurt Eslight. The morning was indeed difficult. Yuan felt like he was on a battlefield rather than at the university. Solving the pride problem will take a lot of time, but in the meantime, we need to come up with a new plan. The only one who didn't care about all this was Russell. All she wanted was to pet Eva, Yuan's living artifact. This place is full of secrets, and Yuan's first lesson as class president of an 11th grade class filled with unique personalities was full of surprises. And this was quite difficult, because the lesson began with significant difficulties. The first lesson will be a light sparring match between two classes. The class of special students was clearly outnumbered by the other class, and besides the numbers, they were even inferior in abilities. The teacher asked the students to choose an opponent with whom they would like to spar. The students from the other class wanted to deal with the special students as quickly as possible, each of them eager to fight first. But Yuan's class didn't have the same enthusiasm. On the contrary, they didn't understand their zeal. Eslight assumed that since the academy divided the classes based on the students' abilities, the first special class hated the 11th. Moreover, Yuan was wearing the headman symbol, which further provoked his rivals. One of the opponents considered it impudent to wear Professor Yumina's brooch and did not agree with it. That's why he, more than anyone else, wanted to deal with them. Meanwhile, Professor Yumina didn't understand why her students were assigned a joint meeting with the special class on the very first day. Besides, practice in real combat is not at all like a specially selected student from the lower dimension being able to hold his own in sparring with someone from the upper class. Someone must have been planning a prank when they made the schedule, but the professor still felt some malicious intent. The first sparring match was to be between Yuan and Erecto, but the young man replied that he couldn't because his fighting skills were still insufficient. For this, the teacher immediately took 3 points away from their team and said that this was not an excuse, so the fight would take place. Yuan didn't understand why the teacher was dragging him into sparring. Was it really to humiliate him in front of everyone? The young man added that he was accepted as a specially selected student because of his unique abilities, not his combat skills, so it would be more logical to evaluate him differently. After Yuan's words, the teacher became angry. It was unacceptable for him that some student would teach him, and for this he took away another 5 points. Yuan said he was willing to spar, but only if he had a week to prepare, then he would be willing to compete. The young man believed that within a week he would be able to enter the upper dimension and return from there stronger. After such a speech, everyone present in the arena fell silent, but not from delight, but rather from the stupidity of what they heard. The students understood that within a week he would be able to prepare for a sparring match against Erecto. Yet, among them, there were those who were intrigued by Yuan's words. After all, the young man says that he can confidently confront someone from the special class with just a week of preparation. The teacher was not particularly happy with his proposal because he again ignored it and set his own conditions. And yet, he agreed to it. Next Tuesday, an official sparring match would take place between 2 students, Yuan and Erecto. The format will be completely open, and the entire academy will have the opportunity to watch the broadcast live. The teacher also added that since it was Yuan who requested the preparatory period, it would be better for him to show off his full abilities. Yuan replied that he would show everything he could and was also looking forward to the match with Erecto. But Erecto irritated him more, because it was quite difficult to see a worthy opponent in the boy. Yuan also managed to find out the opponent's characteristics using the same all-seeing eyes. Literally everyone's stats were superior to Yuan's, even his friends. As he approached them, he noticed that they looked quite uneasy. He wondered if it was because of him. But they were more worried about Dakoyun, who was already warming up and was ready to fight against anyone. Unlike the headman, she specializes in fighting. Dak Goyen looked confident, knowing that she had superior characteristics to most, if not all, of those present, so she was ready to fight against anyone. But looking at her, the other students completely lost their desire to fight. And it wasn't strange, because even Yuan, with his own eyes, couldn't fully comprehend the extent of Dakoyun's power. It was simply impossible for the students from the first class not to sense her overwhelming aura. She didn't understand what was going on. Should she really back down because of their lack of self-confidence? So she decided to challenge Erecto to a sparring match, since he was the noisiest of them all. Dak Goyan was more than confident that he would agree to go against her, and she would easily defeat him. Erecto's original target was Yuan, so he didn't want to fight anyone else, much less Dak Goyan. If he falls for Dak Goyan's provocation, she will really beat him up, and he will be so injured that he won't recover within a week. Not that it bothered Yuan. He didn't care. He wanted it to happen, so he decided to try to stop Dak Goyan. Yuan said that Erecto already had a sparring match scheduled with him, so if she wanted to fight, she should wait her turn. He is, of course, grateful that she stood up for him, but he will still be able to defeat Erecto himself. After all, he must prove that he is worth something with his own efforts. Dakoyan thought that Yuan was just a guy who relied on various tricks, but it turns out he has a bit of manliness, so she doesn't mind. Erecto didn't even have time to say a word before everything was already decided for him. Meanwhile, Dakoyan's desire to compete with someone had not subsided, so she asked again if there was anyone willing to fight her. But, as expected, there was only silence in response. No one wanted to even try to resist her. Dakoyan was disappointed because just a couple of minutes ago they were so noisy and wanted to compete. But as soon as someone stronger came out, their barking immediately died down. She literally called them dogs, and one of the students was not happy with such loud statements. He added that the weak and stupid always form packs, growl, and pretend to protect their small groups. Therefore, such a spectacle simply cannot fail to please. Even though he was a special education student, his aura was different from the others. He was like a bird on a completely different plane. S-Light noted that this guy's name is Ortima, and he is the ruler of the dimension Kedius. It's not that Yuan hadn't heard of Ortim. He didn't even know such a dimension existed. S-Light added that beyond the unification there are 10 upper dimensions. Ortima is from a family that rules one of them, Kedius. So he is one of the top 10 families among all dimensions. Before the sparring began, Ortima asked the teacher to turn on the recording device to record their sparring. Yuan didn't understand why this was necessary, but S-Light replied that it was necessary so that the video could be shown on the intranet later. Yuan replied that he knew that an intranet was a network created by educational institutions to exchange information. S-Light was surprised when the young man told him this, since he came from a lower dimension and didn't even know about the unification. So how did he know about the intranet? Meanwhile, the students found a live broadcast of Dakoyan and Ortima sparring. Now everyone, including academy students, will be able to see their fight. For some reason, the teacher wants to put specially selected students in an awkward position, but he is unlikely to succeed. The aura of the two opponents was simply off the charts. It didn't seem like Dakoyan was inferior to Ortima in strength. Dak Goyan even didn't mind letting him make the first move, calling him a newbie. Ortima was surprised when she called him a newbie, so he wanted to demonstrate that he was an experienced warrior. He used a technique that could distort nature and put pressure on the opponent. It was the first time Yuan had experienced something similar, so he didn't immediately understand the essence of his technique. His power was significantly different from the one Yuan controlled, like water flowing down. Plus, the air became thicker, making it hard to breathe. It felt like everything around was being squeezed and collapsed from within. It makes you fall to your knees as if it were the most natural thing a young man could do. Yuan realized that his technique was a distortion of the laws of nature. S-Light was surprised when he learned that Yuan had just figured out how his ability worked. Meanwhile, Russell was feeling uneasy and was very scared and trying to hide behind Yuan. But it wasn't Ortima's technique that frightened her, but the power that Dakoyan possessed. She simply increased her energy without any effort. In this way, she was able to completely suppress the opponent's energy, as if nothing had happened. Yuan was delighted. He knew that Dakoyan was strong not just by words but to be so. Ortima was also pleasantly surprised by his opponent's abilities. It seemed she really was capable of something, as he thought. Dakoyan wasn't thrilled. To her, such a technique was weak. She called his strength as ridiculous as his horns. But Ortima's attack did not end there, and he planned to attack again, but Dokgoyen no longer stood aside. With incredible speed, she suddenly attacked her opponent and was quite successful. Ortima did not expect such a quick attack from Dokgoyen. She, in turn, did not want to let him attack twice, because he had too obvious an attack, which became stronger the closer he was. Ortima's confidence gradually faded, and he decided to fight seriously using both hands. But Dokgoyen seemed to be one step ahead, or to be more precise, already behind his back. Ortima tried to attack her, but the girl's agility allowed her to easily dodge, and then strike the opponent. She described his movements as stiff and clumsy. Dokgoyen was disappointed because she thought Ortima would be much stronger. Ortim was even more angered by his rival's words about him being weak and clumsy. Eslight was delighted to see Dokgoyen effortlessly dominate Ortima. She literally crushed him, leaving no chance for victory. Yuan noted that Ortima looked like he was simply used to suppressing his opponent's actions. He was not accustomed to fighting, contenting himself with only the technique of distorting the laws of nature. And when an opponent like Dokgoyen appeared before him, who was able to suppress his technique and then attack in close combat, he became vulnerable. Sparring with Dokgoyen proves that his method doesn't always work. Of course, Ortima had talent and potential. You certainly can't call him weak. He had the power of suppression and physical abilities, but he himself did not move. Eslight was surprised at how Yuan noticed all this. Dokgoyen, who fights on par with Ortima, and Yuan, who at this time comprehends them in both. They are truly special selection students from the lower dimensions. The sparring was difficult to follow. Only one thing was clear. Dokgoyen was in the lead. Ortima could only defend himself from her attacks. To him, it felt more like an insult, and that angered him even more. But Dokgoyen did not lose her pace and continued to attack her opponent. Suddenly, Ortima finally dared to counterattack her. He was beside himself with anger and was not going to tolerate any more humiliation from her. Now he not only wants to defeat her, but even more to kill her. But Dokgoyen merely replied that the concept of death was not something a child like him should talk about. Now this is not just a sparring match to assess abilities, but a real battle to the death. It seemed that one of the students would strike so hard that he would kill his opponent. But luckily, at that moment, Professor Yumina appeared and stopped their sparring. Her technique was like slowing down time. Suddenly, everything around her stopped. Flowers appeared on the arena, as if she had transported them to a flower meadow. Yumina also noted that the academy does not encourage students to fight to the death. Therefore, she would prefer that her strength be spent on passing the tower. The entire arena looked like a field filled with flowers, with bright and beautiful petals falling from the sky. The spectacle was extraordinarily beautiful and outstanding. It was a real stroke of luck to see something like this. Yuan thought it was just an illusion, but for an illusion, the scent of the flowers was too strong. The students, of course, were not happy with the professor's intervention, and still could not decide which of them was stronger. Ortima didn't say anything and decided to simply turn around and leave. Dokgoyen was also surprised by how strong Professor Yumina actually was. Returning to her friends, she asked them what it had looked like from the outside. Yuan replied that it had truly been amazing. At this time, Rushel bumped into Yuan's back while hiding from Dokgoyen. While others admired her strength, she was still afraid. Yuan found something cute in her actions, while Dokgoyen found it more irritating. Meanwhile, the professor scolded Teacher Farrell for deciding to pit students against each other in sparring from the very first lesson. Such actions are not acceptable at the academy, so he will be punished. The teacher apologized and said that he realized his mistake, but the professor only replied that a simple apology would not get him off. As she approached the students in her class, she also noticed that Yuan had an upside-down badge. Yumina said that for a class president, dignity is everything, so there is no need to wear the badge like that. It seemed that all the conflicts between the students had died down, but the professor's actions created another one. After this, the other students began to hate Yuan even more. Meanwhile, the entire internet was discussing Dokgoyen and Ortima's sparring match. Everyone was delighted that the girl from the lower dimension was able to fight on equal terms with the ruler of Cadius. The incident with Yuan and the professor also didn't go unnoticed. After that, the young man's ill-wishers increased significantly. The entire internet was discussing the incident that happened that day. Dokgoyen didn't use social media much, so this all seemed strange to her. She was also surprised by the fact that many considered Ortima promising. She, however, is convinced of the opposite. Then in the arena, she noticed someone more capable than him. Dokgoyen asked if Yuan had seen her, but he replied that he hadn't because he was focused on her sparring. The guys weren't familiar with internet slang either. S-Light, of course, tried to understand what was being written about them, but it was difficult. Everyone was talking about nothing but Yuan and Dokgoyon's sparring. And speaking of everyone, S-Light noticed something odd. Had Russell always sat so far away from them? Had something happened? She looked terrified of Dokgoyon and couldn't even get close to her. Yuan couldn't imagine them sharing a common room. Maybe she's just nervous after sparring. So Yuan, as a class leader and a friend, decided to cheer everyone up by taking out some jam from his inventory. It was a concentrate of 1,000 fruits, a special elixir-like jam he'd created. Besides its incredible flavor, it also boosts stats. Looking at the jar of jam, S-Light and Dokgoyon were surprised and did not quite understand what was going on. Yuan opened the jar and asked for some bread. The aroma of the jam was so outstanding that it even reached Russell, who was sitting on the edge of the table. Yuan spread the jam on the bread, and it shone like molten gold. The taste was so sweet that it was impossible to describe in words. The young man was glad that his friends liked the jam he made himself. The taste was incredible. Dokgoyon added that she'd tried all the delicious things from the Central Plains, but this was on a whole other level. Russell also wanted to try, but due to fear of Dokgoyon, she couldn't join. Still, she managed to overcome her fear and try the bread with fruit jam. As she expected, the taste was amazing. It was something completely new to her. It was so delicious that Dokgoyon asked Yuan to make another batch of this concentrate. He, of course, didn't mind. Friends said the taste was precious, but Yuan said that wasn't quite true. It wasn't particularly expensive, but since they were a team, it was nice to share something good. So this can be considered as gratitude for the kindness they showed him earlier. Dokgoyon decided that in exchange for the elixir, she would teach him martial arts. She will teach him all the basics and other skills he needs, so that Yuan can fight back against Erecto. They moved together to the training field to begin their martial arts training. There was enough space here to move freely. Yuan didn't even have time to finish his meal before Dokgoyon teleported him to the training room. He was curious about what she was going to teach him, but Dokgoyon ignored him and immediately began teaching him. The first thing he needed to learn was not to make any sudden movements. The movements should be smooth and focused, so the first session won't be difficult. Before Yuan could blink, the Dokgoyon sword appeared before his eyes. He was amazed by her speed and skill. If this had been a real fight, he would no longer be alive. Dokgoyon called it the stab. It would be Yuan's first mastered move. This movement, executed without the slightest hesitation or doubt, made it hard to believe that this stabbing attack was made by a living being. However, Yuan managed to notice something in such a short moment. It was this new concept of piercing that Dokgoyon used to perform this attack. Yuan didn't understand why it was called piercing. Wasn't that closer to fencing? He was so engrossed in his thoughts that he didn't hear what Dokgoyon was telling him at all. She continued that a thrust does not exist on its own, outside of a combination, and can be the conclusion of anything. But it doesn't matter. What she shows him is the most basic and fundamental essence of a thrust. His skill in using it depends on how often he stabs. It is also important where he strikes from. It is important to think about what he is trying to imitate when he stabs the enemy. And finally, what is the intention behind this blow? Dokgoyon noted that these are the basic principles of thrusting. There are also countless variations, but the basics remain the same. Yuan was amazed by Dokgoyon's martial arts skills. He did a little analysis of Dokgoyon's actions, who had mastered one concept to perfection, which felt much deeper than several concepts mixed together. Now it was Yuan's turn to try a stabbing attack. Yuan warned her that of course it would be a pathetic parody, but he would still try. Dokgoyon replied that if he were able to perfectly copy her movements the first time, it would mean that all the years she spent honing the skill of this strike would be meaningless. Yuan attempted a kick, and it was very similar to what Dokgoyon showed. She was delighted to see that he had managed to master the essence after seeing her move just once. But Yuan thought that this was not it. He needed to focus more to repeat the strike. Before this, he had been too focused on combining concepts and thought that it was enough to strengthen them simply by combining them or adding new ones. But that's not all. His strength can increase even more by improving what he has already mastered. Yuan was faced with the question: if there were many symbols for stabbing, why did he choose piercing? He used it because to her, a thrust means to pierce the target without fail. The goal is to quickly and powerfully pierce the enemy, inflicting a fatal blow. The more Yuan delved into it, the more he was able to replicate Dokgoyon's strike. She was delighted with the speed with which the young man was learning. Still, there's no point in exhausting yourself from the very beginning, So we can finish for today. Doc Goyen advised him to use the attack when there was more space and against an enemy he could defeat. Through Doc Goyen's training, Yuan discovered new characteristics and improved old ones. He was surprised to find that he could increase his stats simply by swinging his sword a few times. He mastered the martial arts concept of piercing and fencing. At first, Yuan thought that he had only improved his stats a little. His stats skyrocketed, and he had just learned the concept of pierce, and it was already at level 16. Moreover, his swordsmanship, which had never grown no matter how many goblins he destroyed, had grown to 20. The young man's fighting skills doubled, an amazing result. Doc Goyan didn't expect him to master the strike so easily. She didn't even think Yuan would be able to demonstrate the technique's essence, even with a practice sword. He replied that he was simply repeating after her. But Doc Goyan countered that if that were the case, why couldn't everyone master the kick like him? Yuan added that maybe it's because she's a good teacher. After all, when he first saw the piercing blow, he was able to feel the full depth of her movements. Yuan was surprised that anyone could even achieve such a level of skill. This embarrassed Doc Goyan, and she didn't understand how he could say such embarrassing things when they didn't know each other well enough yet. In any case, Yuan was sincerely grateful to Doc Goyan for the lesson and truly enjoyed learning from her. She could keep his elixir for herself, to which Doc Goyan replied that it was hardly worth the time she spent studying. Yuan didn't know what to do in such a situation, how to compensate for her time. But Doc Goyan replied that everything was fine, and that he would compensate her in time. It was the first time Yuan had seen her smile so genuinely. From the first meeting, he considered her cold and unapproachable. But the more he got to know her, the friendlier she became. The training was over and it was time to return to the academy. Meanwhile, things were not boring at the academy either. One event followed another. Since Russell was very attractive and sweet, many guys tried to get to know her. And basically their methods were to demonstrate their strength in front of her, thereby allegedly showing their masculinity. Of course, Russell didn't want to meet anyone, so she tried to refuse in any way possible. But fortunately, at that moment S-Light was next to her, and he didn't let anyone harm her. He stood up for her and said that if anyone needed anything from her, they should tell him. In response, he called him a non-entity from the lower dimension, and these words made S-Light even more angry. Just at this time, Doc Goyan and Yuan returned from training. Doc Goyan noted that they were just in time. Everything was just beginning, and Yuan suggested that his friends go somewhere. The ill-wishers decided to retreat, but only now, promising to return. Yuan asked S-Light what happened, but there was only silence in response. The troubles didn't end there. Those guys were also present at the history lesson, and they continued to follow Russell, ignoring comments and requests not to do this. Teachers also turned a blind eye to their inappropriate behavior. For Russell, this put a lot of pressure on her and interfered greatly not only with her studies but also with her life. Yuan and S-Light couldn't just stand by and watch their friend get bullied, so they started to come up with a plan. Regardless of the place, be it a lesson or another place, they continued to harass the girl. The professor ignored the trio, but S-Light decided to intervene and inform him about it. S-Light said that some students were making a lot of noise and were preventing him from concentrating on the lecture, and could he please intervene? But the professor ignored him, replying that students should not talk during lectures to avoid losing focus. S-Light and Yuan were surprised by the professor's decision, because he is the one who should fight for justice and the safety of students at the academy, but everything turns out the opposite. The trio continued to harass the boys, but now the center of their attention was S-Light. Even then, they didn't like him when he stood up for Russell, and after that he became their enemy number one. They didn't understand why he was trying so hard. Maybe they were dating and that's why he was standing up for her. S-Light could no longer tolerate the nonsense of ill-wishers and was ready to start a fight right during the lesson. But Yuan asked him to calm down and think about the situation calmly. S-Light didn't understand why Yuan was telling him to back off when it was their classmate. But Yuan argued that there was no point in getting involved in stupid things. Making trouble in class will only make things worse, so a different plan is needed. For example, you can use the intranet. The professor broadcast their lecture on YouTube so other students can listen too. But the camera was positioned so that the three of them were not visible. So Yuan wanted to move the camera closer to them so that not only they could be seen, but their conversations could also be heard. Now everything they say can be seen and heard live. All thanks to Eva, who held the camera and was practically invisible. Meanwhile, the comments didn't take long to come. Viewers began to criticize those guys and ask what the professor was doing at this time. Yuan also named the broadcast Unification Story, to attract even more attention. Russell was grateful to her friends, but she was still worried that it might lead to trouble. And suddenly, three guys noticed this broadcast and immediately started looking for the camera. They started looking for the camera and the one who started the broadcast. After some time, they finally managed to find Eva, who was holding the camera. They started shouting at the entire audience that it was all S-Light's fault and that it was his snake. And then the professor intervened. The professor was extremely unhappy with the students disrupting his lecture and ordered them to state their name in class and then leave the room. They tried to justify themselves to him somehow, but the professor was so angry that he simply kicked them out of the classroom. His anger knew no bounds. He promised to give them bad grades for the rest of the year and once again reminded the students not to disturb the order in the classroom and to listen carefully. Yuan and Eastlight weren't happy with the teacher's decision because those guys had said so much about Russell, and in the end, all they got was 2s. But Russell convinced the guys that everything was fine, that was enough. She was extremely grateful to her classmates for not leaving her in trouble. This made Yuan a little embarrassed, and he replied that he just wanted to help and there was no need to thank him. Russell was glad that she finally had such good friends. S-Light was also glad that Russell was okay now, and added that he was still glad that Yuan was the headman. Dakuyan was of the same opinion as the other guys. However, the group's main troubles did not end there. They crossed paths again during the next lesson, and now the trio looked even more vicious. The boys thought they were finally finished, but it turned out that it wasn't so. But this time, their target was not the seemingly defenseless Russell. Now their target was S-Light, whom they wanted to take revenge on for the moment with the camera, thinking that it was him. They were waiting for him to explain what happened yesterday in class. After all, it was because of that broadcast that their grades for the semester were ruined from the very beginning. Moreover, because of this incident, they are now avoided by other classmates. But what was even more annoying was that the teacher didn't try to intervene in this situation, as if he didn't even notice them. It seems that the faculty really don't consider students from the lower dimensions to be human. The situation escalated, and it seemed that a fight was about to break out. But S-Light did not want to continue the dialogue with them in that tone. He explained to them that if they wanted to talk to him, they should ask him more politely and not like savages. This made them angry. They were ready to fight, despite the presence of the teacher. This answer angered them even more. They could not tolerate a conversation in such a tone from a person from a lower dimension. But S-Light did not tolerate it and drew his sword, knocking the enemy's sword out of his hands. The conflict escalated even further, and Yuan and the rest of his classmates were surprised by this outcome. Yuan's surprise knew no bounds. Using his eyes, he also noticed that S-Light had used a new concept. S-Light lost his composure and was furious with his ill-wishers. Out of fear, one of them pulled out a blade, but compared to S-Light's sword, it looked ridiculous. S-Light repeated to them once again that he would only speak to them if they asked him politely. S-Light, who usually looks like a whiny young man, suddenly looked like a brave knight. Yuan was also surprised at how S-Light suddenly changed completely. He didn't believe that such a thing was possible. Maybe it's because of his sword, maybe his sword has some strange concepts. S-Light exerted such intense pressure that the opponent could not even move. Dakoyan also found his sudden change in behavior strange. Meanwhile, S-Light asked the teacher what grade a group that suddenly attacks their classmates with real swords during class gets at the academy. To which the teacher replied that the academy does not encourage outside sparring, so there could be punishment for this. S-Light didn't agree to sparring, so the incident can be considered an attack. The teacher said that was all true, but the student revealed his personal artifact, to which S-Light replied that he was simply reacting to their attack. S-Light argued his case and believed that even if they had started a fight, the teacher would have simply stood aside. His words made the professor angry. S-Light asked him what the teacher would do about the insults and slander that had been spat at him, to which he merely replied that he had not noticed it. This made S-Light truly furious, and he brought his sword to his opponent's face. The young man could no longer control his anger and was dissatisfied with the professor's decision. But fortunately, Doc Goyen stopped him with a powerful flick. She merely flicked him, but with such force that S-Light immediately came to his senses. Doc Goyen said that he needed to be more restrained and not draw his sword, wave it around, and think himself all-powerful, acting arrogant. S-Light's energy disappeared and the teacher was no longer standing aside. He really only treated S-Light that way because he was from the lower dimension. Meanwhile, Yuan and Russell continued to stand aside so as not to get into any more trouble. Doc Goyon continued to scold S-Light, saying that this is what he really is like when he has a divine weapon in his hand. After such an outburst of emotions, Yuan suggested that the guys not get involved in such things again, because then they would not be treated well at the academy. Light didn't think that Yuan was the one to talk about it, to which he replied that he wasn't the one who tried to fight the professor. And besides, he made an official statement about his sparring, unlike Light. Light thought he could improve the situation like Yuan did last time, but he ended up almost causing big trouble. Yuan didn't understand why Light left the provocateur alone and immediately tried to fight the teacher. If he'd been in his normal state, he wouldn't have acted so recklessly. But it was as if he'd suddenly changed, as if someone had flipped a switch. Besides, his sword, Yuan asked Light to be honest with him, and asked about the power he had shown earlier, wondering if he could control it. Light replied that, of course he could, otherwise he wouldn't have passed the entrance exam, but he was just angry at the time because of the professor's lie. Yuan pointed out that this was true, because lying was bad, and Light, looking around, said that this was exactly the case. He asked again if he could be trusted to control his power. Light assured him that this was indeed the case, and that he would cause no more trouble. Goyen also added that she was glad that at least Light said that he would not cause any more trouble, but seeing how his artifact smeared him was quite entertaining. Light was grateful that his friends trusted him, but he was still a little offended. Goyen also said she began to understand the professor's advice that they should be more relaxed around other students. After all, if they continued like this, student life would be even more hectic than it already was. So she wondered what Yuan, as class president, thought about it. Over the past few days at the academy, Yuan had definitely realized the reason for his uneasiness. A way of thinking of others based on inner strength and superiority. An incomprehensible disdain for the lower dimensions, which made everything easier for people from the upper dimensions. And the established norms that consider this the norm were also present. Yuan faced the question, what could outsiders do in a place where such things are considered normal? So he asked his classmates what they thought it took to establish rapport or gain acceptance from any sufficiently large group. Light suggested that conversation, Goyen, oddly enough, was power. Russell, however, refrained from answering. Yuan said it was close, but still not what was needed. He noted that what matters to them is how they look in the eyes of others, so they decided to create a channel about their daily lives. They will create an image of themselves that they will share with others. At the same time, it will become fixed in the consciousness and make them easily recognizable, which in turn can develop into honor and respect. But Light didn't quite understand. If the most important thing for them was the admiration and respect of others, then why would he need to spar with Goyen? Yuan replied that this would not be a simple show, but a sparring match according to the rules, so he had better take it seriously. The sparring between Goyen and Light had begun, and Light had concerns about what was happening. But Goyen said that Yuan shouldn't worry about Light not taking the fight seriously. After all, people become much more serious after taking a couple of punches. So it's just a matter of time, but in the meantime, Light has had a hard time. Yuan thought it must be painful, but at the same time it was a good shot for their channel. Goyen began to mock Light a little. Was this really all he was capable of? And it seemed he truly was nothing without his artifact. She wouldn't mind if he got it, but even so, she could defeat him. Her words awakened real anger in Light, similar to the one he had felt during the lesson when he had drawn his sword. But Russell had concerns about Yuan's idea. Would it really make their lives at the academy easier? Yuan wasn't sure if it would work, but it would still have some effect. After all, if those guys had known from the start what they were capable of, they would have thought 1,000 times before messing with them. At that time, the seriousness of sparring between classmates was gaining momentum. Therefore, Yuan asked her not to jump to conclusions, because her beauty was too valuable for her to worry. He also added that a pretty face with a smile looks even better. Wherever she is with her face, she can win anyone over. So it would be a waste if she frowned, so it's best to save that worry for later. Russell was pleased to hear this from Yuan, and meanwhile, Light leaves the battlefield because he does not intend to fight this monster. The next person on camera was Russell, specifically a video of her eating noodle soup, albeit with a lot of cilantro. Yuan assured her that everything would be fine. She'd get used to the taste. Following Yuan's suggestion, the 11th grade began uploading videos of their daily lives to the newly created channel Uprising. Their videos literally blew up the internet and made them recognizable. People loved everything they filmed, including Goyen and Light sparring. Videos of them all playing a board game together also became popular. Even the video of the tea party in Yumina's office got a lot of views. And as expected, Russell's video became one of the most popular due to her cuteness. Everyone loved their videos for their simplicity, and everyone was even more intrigued by the upcoming broadcast in which they were going to conquer the tower. The guys were absolutely thrilled with how quickly they'd gained recognition on YouTube. Their channel had already gained over 1,000 subscribers in just one day. But S-Light was still concerned about why the video of him being beaten by Doc Goyen had become the most popular on the channel. Professor Yumina was also happy for her students because unification is a higher dimension, full of true miracles. In a world where miracles are taken for granted, no one even thought to create content based on them. But this channel and the content they make have cleverly straddled the line between ordinary miracles, and the connection and atmosphere between them has been simply amazing. However, today was the first day they would enter the tower. The professor was worried about the students, so she asked them to be attentive and asked if everyone was completely prepared. Yuan was the only one wearing a student uniform, which made him feel quite awkward. The thing is, Yuan lived in a peaceful place, so he didn't have any special clothes for fighting. Yet this was the life he had chosen, and the place where he would fight, putting his life on the line, so clothes didn't matter to him. And since everyone is happy with everything and everyone is ready, it's time to head to the tower. Once they moved into the tower, they were immediately noticed by other participants. They immediately recognized them as those same guys from the Vostani channel. The tower is open from dawn, but entry is based on skill level. They are on the second-year line thanks to their fame. There were also those in the tower who were not particularly happy to see them, such as the very same trio that had bothered Russell and then S-Light. But this danger seemed insignificant compared to another more important problem. After all, Erecto was also here, looking at them with a clear desire to kill. So today is the day they conquer the tower, and soon after that, they spar with Erecto. There are only 4 days left, during which time Yuan must become stronger. During this time, he intends to reach such a level that Erecto will not even be able to touch him. The professor also noted that for safety reasons, she would like the students to finish early and return before the weekend, but that this is not her decision, but theirs. So she was interested to know how long they thought it would take to climb the tower. After consulting, the guys came to a unanimous decision. They would need 2 nights and 3 days. During this time, they will be able to conquer the tower and return on time. For Yuan, conquering the tower meant more than just academic success at the academy or the outcome of the sparring match with Erecto. First of all, he wanted to show his ancestors that their work would live on. Before the hike, the students asked the professor if it was possible to film inside the tower. This will be done by an artifact with a personality, created in the likeness of Eve and Lilith. But the professor noted that the footage would be unlikely to be useful, since the tower is characterized by a continuously changing structure. S-Light also read about this in the manual. It said that the tower's internal structure was constantly changing, and the equipment he wanted to take with him would break down very quickly. The professor added that each floor is called a room, and when they defeat the monsters in it or deal with all the traps, the space itself transports the group to the next room. This is called a shift. And the more of them there are, the deeper they go into the tower. Therefore, once the cleansing was complete, they would never be able to return to the same room. Moreover, a new room meant different monsters, stronger than the previous ones, and similar traps. Doc Goyan also had a question for the professor, but it wasn't quite the same as Yuan's. She asked what would happen if one of the students died while climbing the tower. Yuan and Easelight were very surprised because they had already forgotten that you can die right in the battle in the tower. Yumina noted that this was a very important question, and it was good that they asked it. But contrary to their fears in most areas of the tower, the test subjects do not actually die, even if they do. To be more precise, if someone dies, they are simply thrown back towards the entrance of the tower. Moreover, thanks to the student ID card which records their progress, they won't have to start from the beginning. When they re-enter, they'll pick up where they left off. S-Light suggested that since they could be resurrected, they could keep trying as long as they wanted. However, Dokoyan had additional questions regarding this. Yumina said that in most areas, test subjects don't die, meaning there are places where they can die. In this case, the tower does not guarantee them complete safety. The professor noticed Dokoyan's attentiveness and replied that it was indeed so. In some cases, they may actually face actual death. But this did not stop the students from setting out to climb the tower. The first monster they encountered was the Klausider, a notorious monster that devoured all of an explorer's equipment. But thanks to the students' skills and strength, it was not difficult to overcome him. While the others were fighting, Yuan was lost in his thoughts. He'd discovered the concept of fire, but he couldn't extract it. This wasn't a problem in the dungeons, so the young man wondered why he couldn't do it in the tower. Understanding the reason may be the key to unlocking the boy's abilities. Meanwhile, Dakoyon approached him to ask if he'd managed to find out anything. Yuan tried to put out the flames, but it didn't work. Dakoyon replied that it was a shame, because if it had worked, they could have used the features of each location in the tower. Suddenly, a huge Klausider appeared behind the girl, who literally wanted to eat her. But Yuan managed to react in time and repelled the threat. Or, to be more precise, it was Eve, who, although she had taken on the basic form of a snake, could still continue to transform into a weapon. So, getting through this level of the tower wasn't particularly difficult. Yuan noted that he had stronger weapons, but they were a bit noisy. But Dakoyon replied that she doubted his weapon would be noisier than Rushel and S-Lights. She thought it was ridiculous because the basis of dungeon battles is to move stealthily, avoiding enemy detection, and not to smash everything in sight. Rushel and S-Light's fighting style was significantly different from their normal life. Nevertheless, they managed to clear the first room with the Klausiders. But still, you shouldn't relax ahead of time, because there is a strong accumulation of energy nearby, and it looks like a bigger and stronger monster is about to appear. That same elite. S-Light wanted to offer Yuan the use of his eyes to find the target. But at that moment, Yuan was just about to use them. He managed to find something similar to an obelisk that was absorbing a lot of energy, and it looked like someone was supposed to emerge from it. Since it was Rushel who possessed the furious explosive force, she rushed towards the obelisk. Her fighting style was reminiscent of a berserker, seeming to lose her composure during an attack and destroying everything in her path. With a powerful blow, she easily breaks the obelisk, not giving the elite monster a chance to appear. In place of the obelisk, an improved core was formed, which is a very rare item. After picking it up, Rushel began to change, something Yuan was the first to notice. Or rather, her hair gradually began to change color to a darker one. At first, Yuan didn't understand what had happened, as the core shouldn't have had such an effect. Rushel understood the reason and was worried that she would be misunderstood and turned away from. This was a consequence of Rushel's power, a kind of forge of the heart, a concept that uses emotions as fuel, burning them to gain strength. In other words, berserk. Rushel was afraid that perhaps she looked too scary when she was angry. Yuan replied that it was not like that and everything was fine. On the contrary, she seemed reliable. But Rushel was still worried that if things got worse, she might lose control. Dakoyon noted that everything was indeed fine, and she didn't need to worry. Besides, if she lost control, Dakoyon would kill her before she could do any harm. These words caused a mixed reaction from the other boys. Yuan tried to convince Dakoyon that this was unacceptable, as they would have to start the exploration all over again. But Dakoyon merely replied that they would have to continue conquering the tower together if Rushel continued in this manner. Not even that. She would have preferred to be in a group only with him, since the others didn't inspire hope. These words hurt Rushel and disrupted the mutual understanding between the boys. But Yuan promised to think of something and understood why Rushel was so timid. He promised to find a solution, because it was the job of the headman to find a way out. His words made Rushel happy, and now she was less worried about what was happening. In her eyes, Yuan looked like a prince, but from the outside, for S-Light and Dakoyon, it looked strange. Despite all the conflicts, the students managed to pass one shift and go to the second room. The second room was not much different from the first, except for the moss and weeds. The elite monster core that fell from the obelisk had many different concepts, such as acid and fusion. Yuan got as many concepts from just one room as if he had gone through the goblin cave 10 times. Acid and fusion are attributes that can dissolve substances. They apparently appeared when they defeated the Klausither. He fused his sword with the acid and transferred the remaining acid to Eve. Dakoyon crept up to him unnoticed. She too was curious to see how Yuan applied the concepts. She also noted that if he trained his senses better, he would be harder to scare. At that moment, something odd began to happen in the room. S-Light reminded his friends to be more serious, because monsters would appear soon. One should be more careful, but Dakoyon had a different opinion. For her, the second room seemed no different from the first. No matter how careless the lion was, how could an ant's bite kill him? Meanwhile, evil spirits appeared in the room, harmful entities that target the magic inside living beings. S-Light said that enemies are usually caught off guard when they least expect it. Dakoyon suggested a small idea. How about having Yuan go through the room alone? Yuan was surprised, because he didn't understand where such abrupt proposals came from. Russell and S-Light were of the same opinion. It was too dangerous, but Yuan noted that it was the other way around. She explained that he needed to develop his abilities, especially because of the sparring he had to do next week. There was truth in Yuan's words, and Yuan didn't deny it. So he agreed to such an adventure and decided to try to get through the room on his own. S-Light tried to stop him, but Yuan insisted on his own. After all, as Yuan said, he needed to quickly raise his stats, so it would be a waste if they spent all their energy here. He needs to close the gap between them as quickly as possible. Russell and S-Light decided to trust him, but if anything happened, they would immediately rush to help. Yuan also asked Yuan if she would help him if he was exhausted. She replied that at least she promised that he would not die from overexertion. This is what he wanted to hear from her. And now it was time to show what he was capable of. And in this, he will be helped by his living artifact, which is actually his main weapon. He transformed it into a real automatic weapon, which he used back when going through dungeons. With such a weapon, it was no problem for Yuan to pass through the evil spirits. There was no trace left of the monsters. The bullets seemed to burn through them. Russell and S-Light were surprised as they had never seen Yuan's strength before. Could this really be a normal weapon from Yuan's world? The speed with which he defeated monsters was simply astounding. S-Light thought that if the soldiers of their countries had such weapons, how everything would change. His weapon looked like a rapid-fire launcher, but it fired metal pellets. With such a weapon, he could deal with third-class and possibly even second-class assassins. Such an item is useful even in the world of martial arts. However, this style of attack is too straightforward. It is good in long-range combat, but in close combat, the main disadvantage of such an attack was that, in such a tight space, he could easily be surrounded. Enemies can easily strike from a blind spot, which is what happened to Yuan. S-Light and Russell were about to rush to his aid, but it was not necessary. But Yuan didn't only have such weapons. It was not for nothing that he had trained in martial arts with Yuan, so he easily dealt with the threat that had crept up from behind. The boys were glad that he was not hurt, and at the same time surprised when he used the sword. They had no idea he was so skilled with close-quarters weapons. It was indeed not bad, but Yuan noted that it was not good enough. After all, be that as it may, he is not yet as good as S-Light or Yuan. Yuan watched with a smile as Yuan became proficient in martial arts after her training. Yuan combined attacks while Eva killed the enemies in front. He dealt with those who came from behind. The adrenaline in his veins was pumping and he felt himself getting stronger. As a result, Yuan managed to clear the room alone. It was exhausting, but not too difficult. There was one last evil spirit left. Once it was destroyed, the next shift would occur, so Yuan suggested they take a short break. Meanwhile, his abilities continued to surprise Yuan. The part of the monster he'd cut off was melting and disintegrating, yet he was using the skills he'd just mastered in the previous room. How could he learn so quickly? S-Light was amazed by Yuan's resourcefulness. After all, not everyone would have thought of controlling the shift in this way without killing the last monster. Yuan also praised him, saying that it was a good job and the finishing blow was simply superb. She also added that if only he wasn't so focused on quick sword strikes, it would be better. But it was still better than being just a fool who only had a sword, hinting at S-Light. While S-Light was proving to Yuan that he was right and that he too had fought bravely, Yuan decided to get a drink. But only he could enjoy this beautiful and peaceful moment. After all, Yuan had completely forgotten that only he could afford such luxury. Yuan was surprised when everyone looked at him with hateful eyes. He said he had bought the drink in the city. That was the problem. Only he could go beyond the academy. Yuan justified himself by saying that even if he wanted to share, he couldn't because he hadn't bought much, but that was a lie. Besides, the drink simply relieved fatigue. But this isn't the time to think about such things, because they're still in the tower. Yuan wants to go through the next room herself. Yuan wasn't entirely sure why she wanted to clear the next room alone, since Yuan had previously said he should fight to become stronger. In fact, she also wanted to try the soda, since she'd never had it before. But anyway, enough sitting around, it's time to move on. After the destruction of the last monster, the shift began as expected. Meanwhile, Yuan had a lot of thoughts about upgrading his stats. He's already at the Academy's intermediate level. In his time here, he's only swung a sword a few times. But despite this, his fencing and piercing skills, which he had only just begun to master, had already improved. The speed of his progression was simply incredible. With such efficiency, it's worth concentrating on fencing because sparring is already on Tuesday. It all depends on how much he can improve his martial arts skills. After all, the difference between Yuan and Erecto is more than 200 points. It's simply unthinkable. Frankly, there's no way Yuan will be able to close that gap in ability over the weekend, no matter how hard he tries. But while studying with Dokoyon, he caught a small hint. Acquiring skills is important, but improving them is even more important when it comes to developing martial arts. But learning these skills alone would be very difficult. So it would be a huge plus for Yuan if Dokoyon taught him a couple more techniques. Yuan thought it was wrong because it would make him dependent on her, and he didn't like that. There's no need to rush, there's still time to think. While Yuan was lost in his thoughts, he didn't notice how he and his friends began to fall. S-Light managed to grab the wall and shouted for Yuan to hold on to him. But it was too late, and he was quickly falling down. Yuan didn't understand what happened and why the floor beneath them suddenly disappeared. But there was no time to think because he and Russell were falling straight to the ground. And the most terrible thing was right on the floor, a trap with sharp spikes. Yuan used the artifact, managed to catch Russell, who was flying down, and grabbed onto the wall. If he had hesitated even for a second, Russell would have ended up right on those spikes. Luckily, Yuan and Russell managed to escape at the last moment. The young man didn't understand what had happened, why the room was so huge, and why there was a trap on the floor. Yuan thought that this might be the boss's room, but then he heard Dokoyon's voice. She stood confidently with her feet right on the ceiling and advised him not to stay in one place for too long. This is a room with a lot of traps, so he can easily die here. Suddenly, a hatch opened behind Yuan, and arrows flew out at a furious speed. But they weren't the only ones there. The traps seemed to be a weapons depot, and the worst thing was that they were very sharp. The situation escalated, and Yuan needed to make a decision and find a way out as quickly as possible. It was difficult to dodge because he was holding Russell with one hand, who was on the verge of death. But since things have gone this way, the time has come to use your entire arsenal. Using Eva, he managed to dodge the flying weapon. He then grabbed Russell and summoned his new living artifact, Lilith. It was no wonder he bought such a wonderful hoverbike in Ronica. He told Russell to hold on tight because this place was full of traps, and it looked like they were all aimed at them. It seemed like the room was one big trap because there was a trap set up at every corner. It looks like now is the time for Yuan to level up his escape power. But the flying weapon attacked not only Yuan and Russell, but others as well. The traps also reacted to S-Light. He used his artifact, which grants him wings, allowing him to fly freely. With the help of the wings granted by the artifact, he managed to repel the flying threat. Despite this, there was something that was bothering S-Light. The professor said that the traps won't appear until room 20, but they are only in the third, so why has the difficulty changed so much? S-Light was also curious about what artifact Yuan had summoned again. He was, as always, surprised by Yuan's resourcefulness, and even a little envious. Meanwhile, Yuan was trying his best to dodge the attacks. There were traps everywhere they went. At this time, Russell was thinking about the moment when Yuan caught her. She thought that this was a definite sign from him, and decided to act as well. Yuan had a completely different opinion, and was surprised by such a sudden change in the situation. But now he needed to focus on a more important matter: surviving. The attacks continued unabated, and their supply seemed endless. S-Light joined them, not understanding why Yuan had become so bad at dodging when everything had been fine before. But Yuan also had a question. Where did S-Light get those wings? S-Light was also curious about that thing Yuan was riding on. Yuan replied that it was the hoverbike he had purchased and then asked if the three of them were here. Then where was Dokoyon? S-Light replied that he didn't see her. Maybe she fell into a trap. But Yuan said that it couldn't be that she fell into a trap so easily. Meanwhile, Dokoyon, dodging the traps, easily avoided them thanks to her agility. Yuan was sure that she was okay, and that she was currently secretly watching them. S-Light wondered when this would all end. Yuan said the manual said they should hold out here for a while, but how long was unknown. He suggested that S-Light run to the other side while he analyzed the traps. All the traps suddenly aimed at the flying S-Light. Yuan tried to guess the trap's priority. It seemed to prioritize moving objects, so simply standing still would prevent the traps from activating. Meanwhile, Russell noticed that one of the arrows had actually wounded Lilith. Yuan pulled out an arrow and wanted to tell the boys that they just needed to stop moving unnecessarily. But in that case, how will they be able to get through the room in that case? Yuan also noticed something strange. The arrow he picked up suddenly burst into flames. Did he absorb it and study the concept? That's odd. since he couldn't study anything in the first room. What changed? The young man began to think that the reason must be related to his characteristics. Or was it just a coincidence? Yuan wanted to know more about it. And the only way to know whether it's true or a coincidence is to check again. He picked up the sword and somehow managed to absorb it. Without realizing it, he had learned a new concept, although theoretically, he should have received the concept of sword. He acquired the concept of decapitation, and did not understand why exactly that one. Come to think of it, this concept was different from what he had seen before. But at this time, Eslight began to have very big problems. He lost his vigilance, thinking that he only needed to be wary of traps. And who would have thought that water would also flow out of them? But it wasn't just water. Most likely there was something mixed in with it, because after this, Eslight's senses began to dull, and everything around him became blurry. Besides this, he was surrounded by dozens of other traps. If things continue like this, he won't have time to react to the next one. But Yuan rushed to his aid, realizing the situation Eslight found himself in. That's why he left Rushel and at that moment rushed to Eslight. Yuan explained to her that he was going to do something that was very similar to a lottery and therefore did not want to involve her in it. She was worried about her friend, because knowing him, he would do anything to save the people close to him. Meanwhile, Yuan began to come up with a plan. Learning another concept increased the acid and wave values by 10. As Yuan had expected, as before, he touched the water. But what he acquired was not water, but a wave. It now became clear to him why the concept he had previously absorbed was beheading and not sword. At the same time, Dakoyon also rushed to their aid, hearing the sounds of water. As she got closer, she was surprised to see Yuan's actions and didn't understand what he was planning. Meanwhile, he continued to rush faster and faster. Along the way, he realized something. The state of matter in a given form at a given moment determines what concept can be acquired. Those projectiles were aimed at his neck, so they carried the concept of decapitation, not sword. So now he understood how he could repel all attacks and save Eslight. The deeper Yuan's all-seeing gaze became, the further beyond the essence it could penetrate. Eslight was incredibly surprised when he saw Yuan flying above him. It seemed like he was flying straight into the traps being thrown at him. Yuan was sure that in order to repel the shells, he needed to understand their intentions. After all, his strength lies in concepts, and the more he understands them, the stronger he becomes. Therefore, Yuan's strength depends entirely on himself. He rose high up to become a priority for the shells, thus he wanted to read them. Eslight was at a loss, as it looked as if Yuan, having given up hope, was simply heading straight into a trap. Meanwhile, Yuan continued to ponder his best course of action. He realized he didn't need to absorb all the concepts. It will be enough to simply continue to combine them as long as he succeeds, and then separate them into parts. This is enough to break all the shells and move on to the next room. And Yuan's plan was successful. He managed to save Eslight and eliminate all the flying projectiles. Looking at it from the outside, Rushel realized that she had made the right choice by trusting Yuan. Eslight was the one who was most worried about him, so the first thing he did was ask if his friend was okay. Yuan said everything was fine and he was glad Eslight was okay. Eslight was curious about it. He replied that he didn't know for sure yet, but it looked as if everything that was flying at them had merged into a single whole. It felt as if he had received something amazing. Eslight thought that perhaps Yuan had awakened a new ability that allowed him to directly interact with traps. Suddenly, several more traps reacted to them, firing projectiles straight at the boys. The boys were so taken aback that they didn't even have time to properly react. But at that moment, Rushel and Dakoyon appeared and easily repelled the shells. For Yuan, it looked impressive, but Eslight was more surprised by Dakoyon's appearance because he thought that she was already stuck in one of the traps. They managed to get through the third room and move to the next one, between Dakoyon and Eslight again. She called him absurd, as he'd let his guard down again and gotten into trouble, while Eslight considered this a very rude way to address someone who had almost died. Yuan just watched from the sidelines as he saw how well the two of them got along. Regardless, when things get dangerous, they rush in to help everyone. Isn't that proof of intricate teamwork? But Dakoyon replied that she was simply waiting for the right moment, because once she had acquired the debtor, she would ask for the debt when she needed it. Yuan hoped that this sense of camaraderie wasn't just an illusion, and in the meantime, they moved to the fourth room. At first glance, she didn't seem to pose any threat, and there were no traps nearby. But the peculiarity of this room was something else. It was filled with monsters. Yuan was confident that dealing with them would be a piece of cake for him. He used his familiar artifact, transforming it into a firearm, but he couldn't even scratch the enemy. This room contained tower spiders, unique monsters that can appear on any floor of the tower, regardless of level. Easelight also added that they have random characteristics and do not depend on the floor. It looks like this time Yuan won't be able to handle everything alone. They'll have to work together. Yuan wasn't happy with this situation. He found it hard to believe that such powerful monsters had already appeared in the fourth room. But Dakoyun asked them not to interfere. She wanted to show Yuan something, so he should watch more carefully. She used her gust of wind technique, concentrating a strong flow of energy, and she released energy like a beam. This is exactly what Yuan was looking for. Dakoyun easily destroys enemies standing in the path of the energy beam. Yuan was surprised once again to see how strong Dakoyun was. The spiders had no chance to dodge or resist such an attack, so most of them were knocked out. Dakoyun suggested leaving it to Yuan to deal with them. She called herself the most merciful ruler they could ever see. Although Yuan had heard similar words from her before, he still felt uneasy every time. But this is not so important. The more important goal now will be to destroy all enemies. Yuan used his sword and headed towards the spiders. After what Dakoyan showed him, he had more confidence in himself. It seemed that now he would be able to defeat such a strong enemy. And the guys were extremely surprised when they saw this. The spiders' bodies were so hard that the young man couldn't even cut them with his sword. The monster also did not sleep and went on a counterattack. Jumping into the air, he rushed at Yuan. But this is just the perfect chance for Yuan to back off a bit, and then destroy the spider with the piercing blow that Dakoyan taught him. The other guys were also glad that Yuan managed to cut down the monster, but still, it was quite pointless if you couldn't cut them down right away. Yuan can't keep hitting and retreating when there are so many of them around. He'll just fall into their trap. Still, he's more than just a boy with a sword. His primary specialty is his concepts, and from the last room, he's acquired 20 destruction spells. Now is the time to test their compatibility with the sword. And it worked. His artifact sword evolved thanks to its excellent compatibility with its wielder. It is now the Executioner's Longsword, with devastating properties. From now on, it won't be difficult for Yuan to cut down a couple of spiders at the same time. The time had come for the young man to try out his new sword and show his strength. And he succeeded. He easily cut down several spiders at once, which he had not even been able to scratch before. The guys were simply delighted with the young man and how quickly he was getting stronger. But this aroused even greater interest in Dakoyan. Yuan was also surprised by his punch. He managed to land a clean hit, but it felt completely different, as if he had swung too hard. It looks like he still has a lot of practice to do with his new sword. There were too many spiders, so Easelight and Rushel rushed to help Yuan. Dakoyan continued to think to the side about how Yuan had become so strong in that moment. She was surprised at how he managed to cut through enemies he couldn't even touch. It was the first time she had seen someone capable of such intuitive and compelling abilities. He hones his skills without relying on strength alone, and that was truly surprising. After all, usually when someone strengthens their weapon or finds a better one, they end up waving it around like a fool. But he completely lacked that flaw. Even if not now, one day he will comprehend the true essence of the thrust on his own. So Dakoyan saw no point in interfering. However, wouldn't it be a waste if she left things like this? After overcoming the 3 tribulations, Dakoyan was proud to be called the greatest genius in the martial arts world. And now she just stands there and looks at the man whose talent makes her past look pathetic. This state of affairs did not make Dakoyan very happy, and it gave her some thoughts. That's why she wanted to make Yuan her own, so that he would fight by her side. Although Dakoyan didn't say it out loud, Yuan seemed to have heard everything. This sent shivers down his spine. Yuan thought that the boss was about to show up. Yuan asked Dakoyan why she was standing there and doing nothing. Didn't she want the soda he bought in town? Dakoyan really wanted it, but she thought that Yuan really only had 1 can of soda, but that was a lie. Meanwhile, all the students received a message, something that happened very rarely. Not only they received it, but also all the remaining students of the academy who were in the tower. But the content of the message was frightening. It said that all participants needed to leave the tower immediately, from the rector himself. Meanwhile, Rushel noticed a strange aura of movement. But Dakoyan continued to say that she didn't want to fight because Yuan didn't give her the drink. But Rushel told them that the enemies were approaching, so they needed to get ready. Meanwhile, portals appeared and countless spiders crawled out of them. Easelight assumed that this was exactly what the professor had told them at that meeting. The student crystal also doesn't work, and the guys really are in a death trap. It seems they are in a situation where even students can die. The monsters began to rush in a crowd straight towards the young students. There were so many of them that it seemed they could simply cover them. It was simply incredibly complex, and the most frightening thing about it all was that this was only the beginning. The professor said something about the possibility of a space pirate invasion when newcomers were climbing the tower. The problem is that their anomalous invasion leads to the emergence of an unpredictable phenomenon, irregularity. And as a rule, during a normal playthrough, students don't die. But as soon as things become unusual, everything changes. The rules inside the tower are turned upside down. Safe zones become dangerous. The number of monsters also grows uncontrollably, as if someone is endlessly generating them. In addition to all this, the difficulty level of the rooms also fluctuates unpredictably. And at the same time, many other problems begin to arise, such as traps. Therefore, the tower cannot guarantee your safety. You need to keep such things in mind. So if they realize that they are caught in the phenomenon of irregularity, they need to know that this is a really dangerous situation. Therefore, the best solution in this situation is to run as fast as possible in the hope of finding a way out, or find a more spacious room so that the monsters don't crowd them. There were just an awful lot of spiders, so the guys decided to move to a more spacious place. Russell was already beside herself with rage, in particular due to the peculiarity of her abilities. It seemed that there were not just a lot of spiders, but an infinite number of them. Yuan tried to deal with them using the wind currents. S-Light continued to attack along with her, but there were too many monsters. At least Yuan and S-Light could resist them. Russell also did not stand still and cut up the monsters with incredible speed, which made her hair become even darker. She doesn't even say anything anymore, and if her hair changes completely, she will most likely lose her composure. That would be a nightmare scenario, so Yuan didn't want to let that happen. Yuan also noticed that Russell had changed a lot and had gone completely crazy. She also couldn't continue at this pace. If she didn't move soon, the situation would become even more dangerous. Yuan took the drink that relieves fatigue a little from his inventory and gave it to Yuan. For now, he'll hold off the spiders, and in the meantime, she can rest and finish her soda. The girl was glad that she could finally try this miracle drink. Still, she wondered if Yuan could really handle such a crowd. But Yuan already had a small plan, so he was full of confidence. And since there really are a lot of spiders, it will be very difficult to kill them with a sword. You need a more massive weapon, like, for example, a grenade. The explosion was gigantic, as if it weren't a single small grenade, but an entire bomb. Some of the spiders exploded, while the rest continued to burn. S-Light was delighted with Yuan. He once again showed something new and amazing with his power. Yuan told him to rest, and he would kill some of the spiders with his sword. S-Light and Yuan were already a little tired, but Russell had plenty of strength. However, she couldn't be relied upon because she was too unpredictable. Therefore, giving S-Light and Yuan a rest was the best solution. Suddenly, Yuan received a notification window that his sword's blood poison had been increased to 15. He didn't understand why this had happened, but the window indicated it was because he'd poorly grasped the concept of a slashing blow and acquired it. His understanding had reached 2 units. The sword changed its usual color to red and became even stronger. Yuan didn't fully understand how the blood poison effect worked. And when else, if not now, will he be able to find out for sure? Yuan continued to cut down the spiders with incredible speed and strength, not giving them even the slightest chance to get close to him. The hoverbike is good for more than just getting around the city, but Yuan noticed something odd. The trajectory of his sword also widened, so while the slashing blow increases the force of dismemberment, the blood poison increases the range and distance of the attack. But the downside is that the sword uses the owner's blood to do this, so Yuan wouldn't be able to use it too often. It felt like he was getting a blood test with every swing. S-Light was curious about what Yuan was up to again, and what the strange aura was about his sword. Meanwhile, Russell continued to commit genocide among the spiders. Yuan noted that the others shouldn't interfere until they were rested enough, but S-Light replied that he had already rested enough and that Yuan should take a look around. The swarm of spiders, which seemed endless, noticeably diminished. Of course, the guys killed a fair number, but it still looked more like the flow of monsters suddenly stopped. Perhaps the battle is over, or vice versa, because now something like a boss will appear. Meanwhile, Russell completely lost control of herself and her actions. Suddenly, another portal appeared, and out of it came the boss of the room, who was significantly different from the previous spiders. Yuan didn't understand why an elite boss appeared on their floor, since they usually start from room 50. But then S-Light notices something even more terrifying and tells Yuan to look at it. Turning around, Yuan was beside himself with surprise. Usually there is only one elite boss, but they have two. The situation couldn't be worse. It looks like the trap room was just a walk in the park. There's an elite boss both in front and behind, and student crystals don't work. So if they die, it's for good. While the others were fussing and thinking about what to do, Russell had already rushed into battle. She didn't care what kind of opponent she faced. Her main goal was to defeat him. Yuan suggested splitting up. He and Dokoyan would take on one boss, and S-Light would stay closer to Russell. This way, they will have a better chance of defeating the monsters. S-Light rushed to help Russell, although she did not really need his support. Meanwhile, Yuan began to think about how to defeat the boss. He used a slashing blow and blood poison to cut down the spiders, but could he manage to do so against such a colossus? Meanwhile, Dokoyan continued to calmly finish her soda. Yuan knew he couldn't handle it on his own, but he refused to ask Dokoyan for help, so she couldn't tell if it was pride or stubbornness. Nevertheless, she liked the soda, and the taste was quite unusual. So from now on, he will pay his debt to Dokoyan with soda. Meanwhile, Dokoyan had already drawn her sword for the first time. Yuan didn't understand why she needed a sword, since she could handle it even with her bare hands. He thought she wanted to show him some special move, but Dokoyan replied that she just didn't want to get her hands dirty. But still, she wanted to hint to Yuan what he was missing to complete his attack. She'll only show it once, but that blow should be enough for him to figure it out. So Dokoyan told Yuan to look more closely and focus on what he saw. But it was at that moment that Yuan looked away, hearing S-Light's screams. At that moment, he was attacked by Russell, who mistook him for a monster. Meanwhile, the spider released something that looked like a web, but more like mucus, at them. Russell managed to dodge, but S-Light was completely immersed in the substance. The monster also didn't seem to expect that she would be able to dodge his attack. This made Russell even more furious. All her hair turned dark, she completely lost control. Now it felt like a fight between two monsters, rather than a student versus an elite boss. Dokoyan tells him again to stay focused and look at her. After all, she will only show this blow once, so he should remember it. With a powerful slash, Dokoyan splits the seemingly invincible monster into two pieces. It's just a swing of the sword, a simple movement, a cut from bottom to top. In this extremely simple movement, Yuan saw death dividing the world. After this, Yuan received a notification window that he had instantly begun to understand advanced techniques, and at the same time, his control power had increased. His understanding of what he saw, heard, and said also increased by 5 units. Furthermore, the young man managed to grasp a portion of a very powerful and complex martial arts concept. Many concepts increased several-fold. Just by noticing a fraction of her martial arts skills, Yuan's internal code rose incredibly quickly. A force similar to the one with which Dokoyan shattered Ortima's force field, perhaps an enhanced version of the move that breaks through the power of death, was unleashed at that moment. Yuan wondered, how could a human being put such will into their sword? The concept of death he had previously learned became so vivid and clear that it gave him goosebumps. Yuan momentarily lost his focus and seemed to disappear from the world, but Dokoyan quickly brought him back to his senses. She also gave him the core that had fallen from the spider. The core had many concepts, and yet, would it be right if he took it? After all, it was Dokoyan who defeated the boss. But she replied that everything was fine, it was his reward, so he could take it for himself without any problem. Meanwhile, S-Light continued to be in the slime and could not get out, so he asked the guys to help him. Besides, right now Russell is going completely crazy. In such a situation, S-Light looked simply useless. And if Yuan interferes in the fight with Russell, it seems like he will be gone in a second. So in this situation, the only one who can stop the maddened Russell is Dokoyan. After all, among the three, she is the strongest and does not feel sorry for Russell. But she didn't really want to stop her, because she had already done her part of the job. For some reason, Yuan thought that Dokoyan wouldn't like it if one of them died in such an unusual situation, and who knows what would happen next. Meanwhile, the spider seemed to still have the strength to fight and was slowly rising. Dokoyan nevertheless agreed to try to stop Russell, but in exchange, Yuan had to finish off the boss himself. Dokoyan used the wind currents to provoke Russell into attacking her. She wanted the distraught girl to come down to her, but Yuan didn't understand why she wanted that. However, it seemed she had her own way of calming Russell down. The furious Russell jumped off the spider and rushed straight at Dokoyan. It seemed that she could have turned her into dust if she had not managed to dodge her jump. Yet it was no trouble for Dok Goyon to dodge Rushel's chaotic attacks. The difference between them wasn't just strength. Rushel attacked her haphazardly, making it easy for Dok Goyon to counterattack. And yet, even after such a huge effort, Rushel did not give up. On the contrary, she became even more furious, her anger towards Dok Goyon growing with each passing moment. Yuan was surprised at how Dok Goyon managed to handle her. From the outside, it really did look like she was just having fun. But the young man had no time to be distracted by this because he also had something to do. His mission was to take down an elite boss, and it seemed like Yuan wasn't confident he could handle it. But Dok Goyon assured him that if he properly memorized the move she'd shown him, he should easily defeat the monster. Yuan was plagued by doubts about this. Meanwhile, the spider attacked him first, without waiting for Yuan to do anything. Yuan didn't understand what was going on. Why he attacked at the very moment when everyone had retreated from him. After all, he was in a state close to death. Does the boss really still think he can handle the enemy? But the young man also did not continue to stand aside and decided to attack the spider in response. He used Eve to shackle the spider and immobilize it, and it worked. The boys were surprised when Yuan managed to tie the spider so easily. Meanwhile, he continued attacking him with his sword. Thanks to Eva, he immobilized the boss as much as possible. Next, Yuan planned to use a blood poison slash to strike the moment the spider reached its reach. But his plan didn't work out as he wanted. Yuan failed to cut through the spider. To kill the spider, Yuan had to cut off its head. Only then could he kill it. Yuan couldn't understand why it hadn't worked. Was the slash too short? However, there was one more thing. The blood poison wasn't activating properly. Given this, using both abilities in sequence made sense, as Yuan had hardly done anything like this before. However, at that moment, trouble began for Yuan. The spider managed to break the chains that bound him. He attacked him at a moment when the young man did not even expect it. The boys began to worry about him. Would he really be able to defeat the monster? Yuan managed to survive by blocking the enemy's attack, but it was so hard and unexpected that for a second, he thought he wouldn't be able to block the blow. As soon as his paw touched the blade of the sword, Yuan managed to change the angle and parry the blow. If he had taken the attack head-on, the sword and arm would have definitely been shattered into pieces. And yet he didn't understand how he managed to feel it. It was just a moment, but it seemed to turn into an eternity. Perhaps it was because he had seen Dok Goyon's sword technique before. While fending off the attack, he managed to understand and master the concept of flow. His understanding of flow reached a depth of 5 units. Yuan would never have thought that what he saw could awaken the dark essence of martial arts within him, which had been dormant somewhere deep inside that he didn't even know about. Even if he can't replicate Dok Goyon's sword technique exactly, he has a backup plan. The battle between the spider and Yuan continued. But for now, the monster was the favorite. Meanwhile, S-Light began to ponder what Yuan was trying to do. There's such a thing as a parry, a move that blocks or deflects an opponent's attack. It can hinder an attack or prevent a fatal injury, and if successful, it can even counterattack the enemy. However, this is just a tactical concept, not reality. In fact, it's quite easy to die before mastering this skill. What will be, and yet it still haunted S-Light. How can Yuan try to master the technique in such a critical situation? Is it possible to master the technique of parrying in such conditions? Yuan tried to block the attack by redirecting it in the other direction, and he succeeded. Little by little, he began to see and predict the enemy's attacks. Meanwhile, Rushel did not calm down and continued to attack Dok Goyon. Her attempts to hit her were so ridiculous that Dok Goyon only had to put her foot out to make her fall to the ground. Still, Dok Goyon knew that Yuan would be able to draw some conclusions from that first blow, but she never imagined that he would reveal something so unexpected. A combat technique that embodies the essence of flow exists on the central planes. Few have attempted to master it, redirecting an enemy's attack in 100,000th of a second. This technique requires incredible reaction speed, and it looks like Yuan is starting to get the hang of it. Mastering it involves too much risk and effort. Most people prefer simpler methods, such as S-Light. For someone like Dok Goyon, who has always specialized in martial arts aimed at destruction, Yuan makes her see things in a new light. She never thought that an insignificant and meaningless thing, considered an ordinary trick, would turn out to be unusually profound. But simply redirecting attacks won't end the battle. To win, you must transcend boundaries. Since he's come this far, I wonder what Yuan will show if he's able to master the flow to repel his opponent's power. Will Yuan be able to use this to counterattack? And now it was time for Yuan to show what he had learned in this short time. Using the power of piercing and dodging attacks, using the second ability in addition, Yuan managed to land a blow. This time, Yuan was able to pierce the elite boss and cut off his head. Goyon was as happy as if she had killed a boss for the first time. Yuan managed to master a new technique in such a short time, especially in such a critical situation, and, as a result, defeated the elite boss. He succeeded in doing this. Furthermore, he was able to discover another, more powerful concept, thanks to the temporary connection of concepts within the body with an external concept. There are major changes happening within Yuan right now. Since Yuan dealt with the boss, it would be a good idea to help S-Light escape and also calm Russell down. But the young man felt that they were relying too much on someone who could hardly handle the boss, and yet he had an idea how to return Russell to normal life. He absorbed the concept of the web that S-Light was caught in, and then he fed it to Eve, giving her an even newer and more powerful power. After this, he managed to create a magical chain network, another artifact. This net can already be used to catch Russell because she also sucks out magic. This way, at least it will remain motionless, and over time it should return to its normal state. And fortunately, everything worked. Russell returned to her normal state, as if nothing had happened. Even the student crystal began to glow again, meaning it was time to leave the tower. But suddenly, another portal opened nearby. An unknown voice came from it, saying that they had managed to overcome the test. They didn't understand who it was or what kind of voice it was, but it kept saying something about a reward. Suddenly, someone began to appear from the portal, continuing to talk about something. She extended her hand to them and said that she was giving them a chance to make a pact with the thousand-eyed observer. Meanwhile, the professor was eagerly awaiting the students' return. Most of them had already returned, but her class was still absent, and this worried her. But suddenly a portal appeared right in front of her, from which the guys came out. All four managed to escape from the tower safely. The professor was glad to see them together and safe, and the first thing she asked was if the children were all right. She was really worried because there was a notice to leave the tower area, but no one ever showed up. She also asked whether the guys had managed to clean up and what had happened inside, but no one wanted to talk about what happened in detail. They moved a little away from the area where many other students were located to continue the conversation without prying ears. Yuan told the professor that after their fourth descent, they were caught off guard by an unusual room. Only a short time had passed since they entered. So he asked what had happened on the other side when they entered the tower. The professor didn't really want to talk about it, but she still had to say it. The thing is that one of the students was killed by strangers inside the tower. The academy is currently trying to resolve the situation, but the students who were in the victims group are having a very difficult time coping with it. She reminded them of those same space pirates who target new students. And if they kill a student and take his student ID, he will never be able to be reborn and will be stuck in the tower forever. Yuan asked Yumina what happened to the culprit and whether they had managed to catch him. But she replied that they had lost track of him, and the students who were there at the time had no way of stopping him. Goyon noted that this looks like something planned, not just an accident. Even if someone is a student at the academy, there are plenty of villains who intend to climb the Tower of Babel. Goyon continued that for them. The newcomers entering the tower are a great opportunity. By passing the entrance exam to the Great Academy and killing an incoming first-year student, you undermine the academy's reputation, but you receive a position as a tower conqueror and even the coveted student card, so the academy's position is clear. By saying that the attack by these intruders is a test that must be overcome, she completely absolves herself of responsibility. The professor was upset to hear such conclusions from Goyon. But Goyon continued that it seemed like the United Academy was just such a place. One only has to imagine that there are people who brazenly invade the tower that defines the purpose of the student's existence, but is unable to protect them from murder. Isn't this ridiculous for such an institution that claims to be the greatest of all dimensions? Yumina simply replied that everything happens for a reason, and that the academy had an obligation to protect its students. However, once they are inside the tower, this obligation becomes their responsibility. Moreover, if the tower chose an attacker instead of a student, the academy cannot interfere. Since this is the will of the tower, one cannot go against it. Hearing this, Goyon only replied that if that was really the case, then this place would become even more unpleasant to her. Goyon decided to leave to think things over alone. The professor tried to stop her, but Yuan told her to try to understand Goyon because something disturbing had happened inside the tower. Yuan admitted that there was more to the tower than just traps and monsters. He noted that before leaving the tower, they met the constellation. The professor was extremely surprised to hear such a thing from Yuan. The point is that the constellations are transcendental patrons or simply observers. They monitor countless dimensions, and when they find someone they wish to favor, they make a contract with that person. These are transcendental beings that influence the dimension. Constellations provide powerful magic, special abilities, artifacts, and more to compel others to follow them. They demand a lot in return, but even so, few people refuse to enter into an agreement with them. First of all, in a world where power is valued, there's nothing sweeter than their offer. Constellations are undeniably attractive partners. Yuan added that a strange voice, observer of all sights, spoke to him. The constellation promised power in exchange for fulfilling its demands. And although Yuan said this with a sense of fear, the professor, on the contrary, was happy, because they had the opportunity to make contact with the constellation on the very first day of their stay in the tower. For the first time in the Academy's history, simply establishing contact with a constellation so quickly meant their talents had already been recognized. But the students had a very different opinion. Yuan asked the professor if this was all serious, and she answered with complete confidence that it was. The young man asked what the Academy's position was regarding contracts with the stars. The professor responded that she officially declares her neutrality, but if the opportunity arises, she encourages students to take advantage of it. Yuan realized that the Academy was actually encouraging them to sign their contracts, rather than maintaining neutrality. The young man was surprised that in a place like the Academy there was no protection from intruders, but at the same time there were creatures there about which so little was known. The professor asked what exactly the observer had asked him to do. Yuan replied that in exchange for her power, she demands murder. Yumina asked Yuan what he meant by that. He added that she promised to make a contract with the two of them who would kill the other two first. This was the requirement of the constellation for concluding the treaty. The constellation said that only warm, blood-filled veins would carry songs and praise to her. And they are children with amazing potential, so she wants them to kill their comrade and give her his blood. Only then will she accept them as direct descendants of her branch. Until they reached the top of this tower and achieved what they desired, her love would never leave them. And she wanted to start right now. Yuan immediately considered this madness. Someone demanding to kill a friend just to gain power is complete nonsense. Goblin, on the other hand, walked forward and seemed to want to talk to the constellation. She didn't seem like herself at that moment, as if her darkest side had come out. Yumina suggested that Goblin must have released her energy. Yuan replied that that was exactly it. She had caused the constellation to disappear. Yuan added that it was a creature they couldn't even comprehend, treating their lives like toys, and it was disgusting to be subjected to such an ordeal. Due to the current situation, the tower will be closed until the end of the week. This wasn't good news for Yuan, who had a sparring match with Erecto on Tuesday, so he could only spend the rest of the time training. Yuan also thought about writing a report on what happened in the tower using the footage from their camera and asked if the professor would be okay with it. She replied that it was possible and that she would also like to talk about it in more detail after having a bite to eat with everyone. But apparently that was not possible for now. Yuan replied that yes, since after this turn of events, everyone was a little physically and mentally exhausted. The professor was concerned about the students and treated them with understanding. She added that they all did a great job and she was proud of them. Yumina will try her best to make sure nothing like that happens next week and hopes that none of them will think anything bad about the Academy. Eslight and Rushel thanked the professor and decided to go to their rooms. But Yumina asked Yuan to stay a little longer if it wasn't too much trouble for him. The professor had another personal question for him, so she wanted to ask him directly. Yumina asked if the constellation hadn't just promised a contract to two of the four, but had chosen him and Goblin specifically. Yuan was amazed by the professor's insight and replied that it was exactly like that. It wasn't just an attempt to pit them against each other, but rather like sifting gold from sand. The constellation said that Goblin and Yuan would definitely reach the top, but only if they get rid of Eslight and Rushel. She called them her beloved children and ordered them to kill her friends. Then she promised that they would be ahead of everyone and only those with the greatest potential would remain. To kill and to seize, this is real life according to the constellation. Upon returning to the room, Yuan saw Eslight sitting with his knees folded and looking dejected. He tried to lighten the mood by asking him what he thought about the abilities of the other guys in the tower. But Eslight thought that Yuan was teasing him for not sitting like a man. Yuan replied that it wasn't like that. He hadn't even thought about it. Eslight apologized to him, saying that he needed to let off some steam and that he didn't mind if Yuan scolded him for it. Yuan replied that he had no intention of doing so, but Eslight considered this another mockery and said that he was not even worth insulting. Yuan didn't understand why Eslight was acting like this and where all his pride had gone. And suddenly, Eslight told Yuan that he kind of hated him. The young man wanted to answer that he also hated him, but he thought about the consequences this would entail. Therefore, I decided to restrain myself so as not to start another conflict. The atmosphere in the room was tense. After the trip to the tower, the relationship between the guys worsened. Yuan asked Eslight to tell him what was bothering him. Even if it was just a complaint, he would listen to everything. Eslight said that in the world he came from, he was one of the greatest talents. And this was not an exaggeration or wishful thinking. His family, his servants, absolutely everyone recognized and praised his talent. He was their hope for salvation. They also entrusted him with the sacred sword, and it was not just flattery to receive the power of the Tower of Babel and become the last guardian to save them. Thanks to everyone believing in him, he was able to make a contract with the sacred sword and came to the academy with a burden of expectations from everyone. But what happened in the end? No matter what Eslight did, he became a burden to everyone. He was not considered a warrior and was treated as some kind of weakling. Yuan told Eslight that she shouldn't take the constellation's words seriously because she was talking complete nonsense back then. But Eslight had a different opinion because it was Yuan and Goblin that the constellation chose as potential talents, and he and Russell as worthless. Eslight repeated the professor's words that the constellations were transcendental beings, much stronger and smarter than people. And he didn't understand how Yuan and Goblin had so easily refused to sign a contract with them. His words shocked Yuan because he certainly didn't expect to hear something like that from Eslight. He replied that such a proposal obviously made no sense to him. There were plenty of other ways to become strong without someone having to die, and neither he nor Eslight had come here to hear that. Eslight insisted, saying that Yuan only thought that way because he had unrivaled talent. And perhaps if something had to be sacrificed to be chosen by the constellation, Eslight would hardly have been able to refuse as decisively as Yuan and Goblin. He might not have been able to make the same choice, but he would most likely have accepted her proposal. This made Eslight feel frustrated, scared, and unable to forgive himself. After such a cold dialogue, Yuan decided to go take a warm shower. When he returned to the room, Eslight was already in his bed, and Yuan thought that he had already fallen asleep. But Eslight still had something to add. He apologized to him for his whining. It wasn't Yuan's fault. Eslight was just a little jealous of him, and he apologized again for burdening him with uncomfortable stories. But Yuan just smiled and said that everything was fine. After all, despite all the feud and the struggle for supremacy, they are ultimately friends. His words touched Eslight, and he felt even more ashamed of what he had said earlier. Yuan also added that he was always ready to listen to his stories. For now, he'd step out for a bit and left him a mug of hot chocolate. If he wanted it, he could have it. Finally, he said that the things you dislike the most are forgotten when you eat something delicious. Yuan was surprised to see how much Eslight had changed since their first meeting, so he should be more careful with his words next time. Meanwhile, Goblin had crept up on him unnoticed. Goblin was glad to see that Yuan had left the room on his own, and she wouldn't have to go in there. Yuan was surprised to see her. After all, this was a male dormitory and she definitely couldn't be here. But Goblin only answered him, "Not caught, not a thief." And she replied that he was right. This was not the best place for conversation. Goblin said that she found herself here while wandering around nearby, so she decided to come in. She was curious how the dead weight was doing and if everything was okay with it. By dead weight, she meant Eslight. After all, according to her, all he knew was how to swing a sword. Pathetic, talentless, and even less adaptable. But Yuan disagreed. He had talent, and he was skilled in swordsmanship. Goblin said that all of this comes from his sword. That's the problem, and Yuan himself understands this very well. His strong body, keen fighting instincts, and special abilities, all thanks to the sword. Without it, Goblin believed, he would be indistinguishable from a useless fool. Moreover, he can't even figure out what's going on, is deeply unsure of himself, and at crucial moments he gets confused, turning into a fool. Yuan realized that listing Eslight's shortcomings could drag on, so he asked her to stop. But she continued, adding that in a serious situation, if he lost his composure and spirit, it would all be over. At this rate, he will let down everyone who is nearby. Even Russell already feels weak, and if S-Light takes the same position, it will lead to bad consequences. Yuan didn't understand what Dok Goyon ultimately wanted. To insult S-Light, or was he still worried about him? So he asked her what about her, how she was feeling after what happened. She, too, had been acting strange since meeting the constellation, and was irritated in the professor's presence. She's definitely fine. Dok Goyon was a little embarrassed that Yuan was worried about her. She even thought that he found out about it with his demon eyes ability. But Yuan replied that he didn't need to use anything to understand. It was all written on her face. He just asked if she was okay, since he was also her friend. But Dok Goyon took it as a simple consolation. She thanked him for his concern and replied that it was nothing serious. She was just a little irritated. Yuan asked why was it because of the word constellations. She admitted that was exactly it. Perhaps she was thinking the same thing as the constellation. Yuan, of course, understood that Dok Goyon was different from others. But hearing this from her directly, he was surprised. At that moment, Dok Goyon was actually thinking about getting rid of S-Light and Russell. Yuan didn't understand what kind of nonsense she was talking about. But Dok Goyon continued. Perhaps that was why she was even more disappointed. If she had been more decisive and guided only by the idea of leaving the most capable ones around, completely absorbed, she would have killed them. And even if not with her own hands, she would have created the right conditions for it. At the same moment, she was angry at herself for the fact that she could agree to such a thing. For Yuan, each conversation was more difficult than the other. He seemed to have begun to better understand the thoughts that guided his friends. After hearing this from Dok Goyon, Yuan said that by that logic, she could also be called stupid. Dok Goyon didn't quite understand his words. After all, she had told him her most intimate experiences, and in response, she received this. Yuan continued that he considered S-Light and Russell talented. And no matter how incredible the artifact, if they didn't possess talent, they wouldn't have gotten this far. S-Light certainly has a natural gift to be able to wield such a sword. The only problem is that due to his habit of relying too much on the sword, he cannot react to the situation in a timely manner. But he needs a lot of time to figure himself out. It's the same with Russell. Her incredible physical abilities and potential are only held back by her own internal contradictions. It won't be easy, but if they can overcome their own problems, their talent will surpass anything Dok Goyon and Yuan can imagine. Yuan said this with his eyes shining, believing that one day S-Light and Russell would be equal in strength to Dok Goyon. Dok Goyon changed her mind about the boys and said that she would trust Yuan. If they practiced, the results would speak for themselves sooner or later. Yuan asked if that meant she was willing to help. Dok Goyon agreed. And if, as he said, the two of them overcome their difficulties and grow, she would admit that Yuan was right. However, if she is not satisfied with the result, the responsibility will fall on him. Yuan was surprised and didn't quite understand what she was getting at. Dok Goyon said it was because he made her put her own judgments aside and spend time on S-Light and Russell. So if he hasn't changed his mind, let him come to training tomorrow and take them with him. Yuan didn't quite understand why tomorrow morning, since they had only just returned from the tower today. But one way or another, the next morning they were already at training. Yuan and Russell watched in surprise as Dok Goyon beat up S-Light. It seemed like she was just taking out all her anger on him. It seemed that there was no living place left on S-Light. S-Light asked Yuan why this happened. After all, he promised to teach him something new, but in the end, he only got it. Dok Goyon didn't give S-Light even a minute's rest and told him to get up to continue training. She said they were currently training their bodies, and that's exactly how they do it. After all, S-Light isn't the type to change just by seeing something once, like Yuan. S-Light asked to return his sword to him, but Dok Goyon was categorically against it, until he learned to fight without it. He countered that he was a swordsman, so what was the point of taking a sword from a swordsman? Dok Goyon replied that in that case, if he lost the sword, he would simply die. Training with Dok Goyon was truly unbearably hellish for S-Light. Yuan told him it was necessary for him to become stronger. He'd agreed on this with Dok Goyon beforehand, but he didn't expect it to turn out exactly like this. So I asked him to trust them at least once and try to train without a sword. S-Light, of course, didn't want this, but he still agreed because he trusted Yuan. And if he had a plan, then it really meant something. So he trusted him and tried to fight without his sword. Yuan's words motivated S-Light, but it didn't last long. This was immediately followed by an unexpected blow from Dok Goyon and words about how he was too open. Dok Goyon continued to strike, and S-Light didn't even try to defend himself. She told him he must rely not only on his eyes to see her attacks, but also feel them with all his senses. S-Light replied that he already understood that. Dokoyan noted that if he understood, then he should fix it right now. Or his fighting instincts were really that dulled without a sword. It was true. Right now, S-Light's stats were being artificially reduced in real time. Normally, he was a monster that would easily have dealt with a recto. But for some reason, when he's without his sword, his abilities seem to leak away. If these changes are indeed due to the sword, then S-Light's condition is worse than one might imagine. Dokoyan continued to strike and tell S-Light he was worthless and getting weaker. He continued to deny it. She continued, "If you really think so, then let you prove it by looking into my eyes and not at the sword that you can't even hold." And suddenly, something strange started happening to S-Light. He finally managed to break Dokoyan's pace and attack her, albeit unsuccessfully. Yuan and Rushel, who were watching their sparring, were also surprised by S-Light's changes. His appearance changed to that of a woman. Could this really have been hiding inside him all this time? A moment after that, something strange happened to his body again. It was as if everything inside him was burning, and he looked like a time bomb. Yuan ran to his aid, worried about his comrade. But Dokoyan stopped him, saying that S-Light was fine, answering that what happened to him was not so easy to solve. Dokoyan wanted to make sure S-Light knew what the problem really was. He replied that it was. He and Yuan were right. He can't do this anymore either, so he's ready to spar again. Before that, Dokoyan wanted to apologize to him for being wrong about him. S-Light replied that it was not necessary, but Dokoyan continued, "I thought you were an ignorant fool, but if you think about it, you are a fool who carries a bomb on himself." S-Light already thought that she would praise him, but everything turned out the opposite. At this point, Rushel suggested that Yuan have a sparring match to keep up with them. But Yuan was lost in his thoughts at that moment and didn't notice Rushel. With his eyes, he saw something strange. S-Light possessed both holy and demonic spirits. How could such contradictory concepts exist in the same body? That seemed to be the reason for the outburst, but did S-Light understand it? He wanted to talk to him about it later in the dorm. Yuan apologized to Rushel for ignoring her. He'd simply been lost in his thoughts. She replied that everything was fine and suggested they spar. He asked if everything would be okay, to which Rushel replied that she didn't know, but he had a way to stop her. But even if that was the case, Yuan was still afraid of it. Rushel noted that she also wants to learn to control her power and wants to be useful. Yuan finally agreed, but noticed that Rushel seemed oddly motivated today. Had yesterday really shocked her so much? Still, sparring is sparring, and they will fight with wooden swords. Yuan said that it was to set their own pace, and there was no need to be as noisy as S-Light and Dokoyan. So they will increase the intensity gradually, you can start. But suddenly Yuan wondered, was this the life he dreamed of at university? The period of his youth that he imagined was not a chaotic brawl, full of aimless blows and gnashing of teeth. On the contrary, he thought that the young man and woman would encourage each other, honing their skills together. Yuan thought he'd hit the jackpot. Could it be that thanks to Rushel his dreams would come true? While he was lost in his thoughts, Rushel thought that he was already ready for her to start attacking. And 5 minutes later, Rushel was already bound by Eva's magical chains. It looks like she still has a long way to go before she learns to control her power. Rushel asked if everything was okay and how many times she'd lost her temper. Yuan replied that he'd lost count after 10 times, but everything was fine. She apologized for it because now Yuan looks beaten up solely because of her. But he replied that everything was fine, because he himself promised that he would help. So he was prepared for it, so there's no need to be too upset about it. But their sweet conversation was interrupted by Dokoyan, who didn't quite understand why they were flirting instead of training. Yuan denied it, saying he almost died. But in Dokoyan's eyes, it looked different. She thought that perhaps Rushel had some ulterior motives. Dokoyan told Rushel that training while daydreaming was rude to her opponent. Therefore, such thoughts should be left aside during sparring. Yuan noticed that Rushel, who had been so motivated, was becoming embarrassed again. Dokoyan was being too strict with her. But no. Given what happened, isn't it amazing that Rushel even had any motivation? If it had been Yuan, he would have been so upset, and the day would have been a complete waste. Yuan didn't think Rushel had time to improve her mental state, but she's trying her best. Therefore, he did not continue to argue with Dokoyan to try to prove anything to her. Yuan said he recently asked the professor if he could take someone with him when leaving the campus. She said yes. Dokoyan was sure that Yuan would take her with him. But Yuan had a different opinion and decided that from now on, he would take Rushel outside the academy if she was okay with it. The other boys were extremely surprised by this. But the surprising decisions didn't end there. Yuan asked Russell to go on a date with him. Yuan and Russell went into town just to walk around a bit, and the first place they went to was a clothing store. Doc Goyon and S-Light still continued to think that Yuan was up to something strange, but he said that it wasn't so. Meanwhile, Russell had already chosen an outfit and went out to show it to Yuan. The outfit was truly stunning, vibrant, and in Rochelle's style. Yuan also appreciated it and noted that she looked very beautiful, but Dogoyan and S-Light continued to be indignant. It was Russell's first time outside the academy, so everything was new to her. Yuan suggested taking a walk. There was a department store and shopping area nearby, but Russell was so carried away by the beauty of the big city that she lost sight of it for a bit. Because of the crowd, it was difficult for her to reach Yuan, and because of the noise, he couldn't hear her. However, Yuan noticed in time that he had lost sight of Russell. He apologized, saying he forgot that it was her first time in such a place, but Russell replied that everything was fine. To avoid getting lost in the crowd, they decided to hold hands, although it was a little embarrassing. Together, they continued to walk around the city and went into one of the food stalls to have a snack. Then they went to a toy store, where Russell chose a menacing penguin for herself. Such a walk was more appropriate than ever after what happened in the tower. After a vigorous walk, they decided to grab a bite at a local restaurant. It was a restaurant where all the ingredients were made from monster meat. And even though it was monster meat, the taste was amazing. Russell was amazed and couldn't believe that she was eating Ellen meat while in the city. And it was all thanks to Yuan. At this moment, Yuan noticed Russell's strange behavior. Suddenly, she started to worry and Yuan asked what happened, if everything was okay. Russell replied that she felt too excited. For the first time in a long time, she visited the city, and Yuan gave her some beautiful clothes and treated her to delicious food. But she was worried because she couldn't do anything in return. Russell wondered if it was okay to enjoy life, since her stay here was unlikely to help her better control her abilities. Yuan asked her to look at him for a second, or more specifically, at his palm, since Russell couldn't grasp the concept. He explained that the emotions she was experiencing were being formed above his hand. Until recently, his abilities had only detected anger from her. But now everything was different. In the short time they spent together, he was able to read even such short emotions. If they get closer and understand each other better, Yuan is confident that they can find a solution to her power control problems. Can her ability see these problems? Yes, but now she can't. Yuan destroyed the concept of the emotion of excitement as an example of how Russell's problems would disappear. He promised to make sure her problems were resolved and hoped that today she would enjoy the moment without thinking about anything else. Russell was grateful to Yuan. To her, everything he said seemed like magic that became true. Yuan thought that perhaps it was a burden for Russell that they were going out so suddenly, but she replied that it was fine. Russell also said that she would rather talk about how to get closer to her, but Yuan didn't immediately understand what she meant. Russell added that she had talked about Doc Goyan and wanted to be friends with her. Yuan denied this, saying there was nothing friendly about her. The girl replied that compared to others, Dokoyan might be scary to her and others, but it seems that Yuan really likes Dokoyan. But the young man denied this, believing that she rather simply wanted to wield them, like a weapon or a blade. Yuan's analogy was quite strange, so Russell laughed at it. Nevertheless, the girl felt much better after hearing this. She thought that Yuan was an all-knowing wizard or something, but it seems that's not the case. This made her feel like she could try harder. But Yuan didn't quite understand what she was talking about. Still, since Yuan had bought her a lot of clothes and gifts, it was now her turn to choose clothes for him. Yuan simply couldn't refuse Russell, so he accepted her offer. He also told her not to think about the price, but rather to simply enjoy it. Russell replied that dating such a capable man was a luxury, but Yuan didn't quite understand what she meant. Meanwhile, the professor's meeting was not very cheerful. The professor was carrying an artifact chamber. He tried to convince her that everything was fine and that she just needed to wait a little while. At this time, in the teacher's office, they were watching the video recorded by Yuan from their trip to the tower. They were outraged that such a video had been posted on the internet, thereby thoughtlessly spreading information about the tower. And no matter how Professor Yumina views it, Yuan's independence has gone too far. And this is a clear attack on the Academy's authority. So one of the professors, Alex Canton, asked if Yumina was going to take responsibility for allowing the boy to do whatever he wanted. Yumina didn't expect things to turn out like this and was a little depressed. When she first saw the video, she thought Yuan had gone too far by filming inside the tower. When he said he was going to climb the tower and film it, she didn't pay any attention because she thought it wouldn't work anyway. It was clear that artifacts or external devices could not function inside the tower, as magic would destroy them. That much was obvious. However, he destroyed this obviousness and demonstrated the result. Perhaps Yuan didn't even know about it. It wasn't that he'd brought back a recording from the tower, but that he'd created a device capable of operating within it, and that was astonishing. But the laughs didn't end there, as Yuan said he plans to post the video on his and his friend's channel. Yuan thought it was a great way to get attention, since the uprising group was a way to gain the favor of other students. Yumina then asked him again if he was confident in his actions, since the information about the tower, which he had obtained with such difficulty, would be disseminated carelessly, and whether he thought he would regret it in the future. But Yuan replied that other students were also suffering. Moreover, besides this artifact, there was no other way to make a recording, and it was as if it monopolized the information. Some points, such as those about constellations, should be edited before publication. The more information they share, the better it will be for everyone. At the time, she thought it was amazing because Yumina had already talked about the unfairness of reality at the academy, but she never thought that Yuan would resolve it this way. So she just asked him to be careful and remember that there could be consequences. To this, Yuan replied that, as she had already said, it was unclear what changes, big or small, this would bring. So they need to quickly strengthen their position, because wouldn't the professors be calmer knowing that they are okay? Yumina couldn't imagine that one of Yuan's intentions would be so unusual and wonderful. The professor also told him that if he wanted to be safe, he should avoid accidents. And it seems that what he created will lead to the emergence of something grandiose, capable of bridging the gap between dimensions. Perhaps this is why the professor feels he wants to trust and help the young man. When another professor asked Yumina if she was ready to take on responsibility, she answered confidently. Filming and publishing a video from the tower is his personal business, but she understands what the problem is and who, in the teacher's opinion, is to blame. Therefore, Professor Canton's question remains unclear to Yumina. He responded to her words that even her lies were beautiful. And was it really only him who thought that Yuan was being treated specially? But another professor named Thalia Liliana Campanella intervened in the conversation. She was a professor in the artifact creation department and asked Yumina not to frame her, but to simply answer honestly who Yuan really was. Yumina replied that he was just a student, but was interrupted by the combat aura professor, Ryu Chulmyung. He pointed out that since he was just a student, this was unacceptable, and there was a limit to everything. Yumina knew that the information about the tower was the most important. He added that such behavior was a violation of academy rules, but Yumina responded that he was saying strange things. After all, the reason no one had filmed in the tower until now was because no one had the ability to do so. So it was better to think about how they could use the student. Professor Canton asked her what this ability was and what the principle of its operation was, and whether she could explain it so that everyone present would understand. Professor Talia also spoke up, noting that she had been working at the academy for 200 years. Artifacts created outside the tower do not work inside, especially the high-precision equipment needed for filming. No circuit could resist the waves of mana emitted by the tower. The more she studied it, the more convinced she became that such a thing was impossible. Therefore, according to the professor, this is an inevitable law that cannot be denied. But despite this, Yumina says that Yuan managed to do it somehow. Talia says that's exactly what she's asking about, isn't it? A boy from the underworld without mana. How can that be explained? And it's as if there is only one way to find out the truth. To do this, Professor Talia required the artifact that filmed the video. Talia was determined to disassemble it and find out what technology Yuan was using. But Yumina replied that she had to refuse Talia, as she had asked permission to take the artifact with her. But it was an achievement created by a student. Therefore, she couldn't allow anyone to do anything with it. Other professors began to see this as a rebellion against them and a refusal to cooperate. And then another professor, known for his bad temper, intervened in the conversation. It was Professor Zeno Union, head of the constellation department at Babylon and vice-rector of the academy. He asked his colleagues to calm down and refrain from making any comments. He thanked Professor Talia for her research and the efforts she has put in over 200 years. Thalia's confidence and volume instantly vanished when the academy's vice principal spoke. Zeno also asked whether even a professor with such incredible authority in the field considered Yuan's artifact special. Talia replied that it did, and didn't know why. The professor replied that this fact must be too difficult for the other professors to accept. His colleagues didn't immediately understand what the vice-rector was talking about. Zenon said that in short, Yuan is the only one in the world who has been recognized as a tower. The professors reacted strongly to Zeno's remarks, calling them frivolous. After all, Yuan had only just entered the tower the day before yesterday, so he could be recognized by it. Many considered his statement reckless, despite the fact that he is the vice-rector. Zeno replied that they had the right to decide whether to believe him or not. But there was another reason to consider him special. He asked Yumina if he could convince the professors if they shared facts that weren't in the video. Without waiting for her answer, Zeno declared in front of the professors that Yuan and his classmates were the only ones among those conquering the tower who had been chosen by the constellations. This caused an even more violent reaction. How could a guy who had just entered the tower for the first time yesterday be chosen as a constellation? Yumina asked Zeno to be careful in his statements, since contact with the constellation is a student's personal achievement. Zenon replied that in that case, he should answer honestly. He was asking as the vice principal whether Yuan and his classmates had signed a contract with the constellation. Yumina didn't understand why the vice-rector was going so far and replied that no one had signed a contract with the constellation. As Zenon suspected, they were not quite ordinary since they refused the contract. He added that it must have been difficult for them to show their intentions due to the pressure of the constellation's presence. In this case, the vice principal will invite Yuan and all 11th grade students to attend his lecture. The professors again reacted violently to his statement because he himself heard that none of the students signed a contract with the constellation. So why were they receiving assistance in the form of attending lectures at a higher level? Zeno replied that it didn't matter whether they had made a contract with the constellation or not, but that they had been chosen by it. He added that being chosen by a co-star already proves their exceptionalism. From the moment they declined the contract, other co-stars will clearly show interest in them. So Zenon asks his colleagues, aren't these the students who should be receiving help in his lectures? He's the professor who teaches the students chosen by the constellation. And if Yuan was chosen, he's also his student. Now it's time to move on to the agenda, which concerns the recent revelations about interior filming in the tower. For their part, they can't force anything on Yuan, and as far as his abilities are concerned, personal requests and questions will be allowed. But if during the process it turns out that someone is putting pressure on the student or causing him inconvenience, anyone who participates in this, whether a professor or a student, will be expelled from the academy. Yumina realized that this meeting was not about how to bully Yuan, but on the contrary, the vice principal's words expressed the rector's intentions. This was the rector's warning to the faculty. Do not touch Yuan. Now knowing this, Zeno asked the professors to keep this in mind. At this point, the meeting concluded, and he hoped everyone had a good rest of the week. Yumina never thought that Yuan would be able to win the principal's favor so strongly. Meanwhile, Professor Canton suggested that Yumina go to the bar and have a couple of cocktails, if she didn't mind, of course. He also added that he wanted to raise a toast to Yuan's success. But Professor Yumina's gaze said it all. She wasn't interested, so Yumina simply ignored him. Professor Canaton was upset that Yumina ignored him, but his other colleagues invited him to go out for a drink with them. The next day, the entire academy already knew the name Ban Yuan. Many students began to notice him and wouldn't let him pass by. Some wanted to get to know him, some invited him to the student council, and some wanted to know where he was from. But Yuan didn't quite understand why there was so much interest in him. Dakoyon was also surprised to see this and asked the boys what happened. S-Light responded that the thing was that after they posted the video of the tower climb on their channel crossed the 2 million subscriber mark, and the video itself received over 5 million views. So now it's quite difficult to find someone who doesn't know about their channel. Dakoyon didn't think that, compared to his other abilities, filming would be so impressive. Yuan's ideas and abilities are truly outstanding, and watching people's reactions was even more interesting. This also interested Russell in its own way. Friends were happy for Yuan. It must be great to feel like a celebrity. It's much better than getting into arguments with everyone. Besides, they have a ton of fans now, and if anyone talks to them, they have to be kind, especially to Dakoyon. Meanwhile, behind their backs they were already being discussed in a bad light. It was the same trio that had been bothering Russell, and now they were discussing how the video was actually a montage. After all, they went through 4 rooms so quickly in such a short time, and the size of the spider, in their opinion, is clearly a montage. They also continued to say that their blatant lies would be exposed tomorrow. The thing is that tomorrow is the sparring match between Yuan and Erecto. Yuan was sure that those who doubted the video, or still disliked it, were looking forward to tomorrow when Erecto would destroy it. But his friends believed in him and said that he could win. Doc Goya noted that in this case, Yuan will simply be able to meet and support these expectations as best she can. The day of the sparring session arrived. Yuan, though a little nervous, was more or less confident of victory thanks to his friend's support. The duel will be broadcast live on the official school channel, and the teacher asked if the students were okay with this. Without a doubt, yes. The professor added that if they agreed, they simply needed to sign the document. Yuan wasn't entirely clear on the need for such precautions. The document stated that if one of the participants was unable to continue or surrendered, the duel would be considered over. Hitting vital points is forbidden, but injuries are inflicted at one's own risk, as if they are telling them to hit until they become crippled. Erecto called him a negotiator and asked if he was afraid of him. Yuan was surprised when he called him that. Was he really subscribed to their channel? Erecto continued to say that if he was afraid, he could just give up. But only if he crawls between his legs and barks like a dog. Only then will he accept his defeat. Yuan was shocked by this statement, and it seemed that Erecto was extremely serious about the fight. Although Yuan became popular thanks to his channel's videos, many still hated him for being a creature from the underworld. Meanwhile, Doc Goyan, S-Light, and Russell checked to make sure everything was all right with the YouTube broadcast. They were also interested in reading what other viewers were writing about Yuan. The stream had over 10,000 viewers, but most of the comments were insulting. Doc Goyan noted that this was to be expected, since the number of people who liked them based on their best videos could be counted on the fingers of one hand. So now that so many people are watching them, there is no other option but to prove your competence. And whether Yuan is talented enough to reach the top or not, he must show his best side today. Meanwhile, Yuan pondered Erecto's words. He never would have thought he'd hear something that sounded more like cheap rants from a third-rate novel. But he didn't want to look third-rate in comparison, so he responded to Erecto's offer in a rather rude manner. This made Erecto even more angry, and he asked Yuan how long he could pretend to be so calm. But Yuan replied that whether he was pretending or not, Erecto could check for himself. These words angered Erecto even more, and he was already impatiently waiting for the moment when the professor would announce the beginning of the duel. With both participants ready, it was time for the sparring match to begin between Erecto from Class 1 and Yuan from Class 11. As soon as the professor said this, Erecto immediately rushed into attack. Yuan didn't expect such a quick attack from him, but thanks to the training and experience gained in the tower, he dodged his blow without much difficulty, and then he counterattacked cleverly. No matter how you look at it, Erecto's size was off the charts, and this greatly affected his speed. Yuan was able to punch Erecto right in the face when he didn't expect it. The blow was so powerful that he fell to the ground. For Yuan, the most effective way to fight face-to-face with such a boulder was with the method he had recently learned. Just the day before the sparring, after a date with Russell, the whole group went to training. Doc Goyan wanted to teach him a new technique, but before she began, she noted that the technique allowed for quite a bit of trial and error. The point is, it's good for an inexperienced user because when facing a new opponent, you need to be able to use their own attacks against them. Only then can you say you've mastered the theory. Therefore, Yuan needed constant training to apply this method in any situation. Doc Goyan planned to attack him with a baton, constantly varying the speed and force of her blows. If he could even just once withstand such an onslaught, that would already be a good result. Although Yuan himself didn't share her opinion at the time, either way, the technique really did work. If he did it right, Erecto wouldn't even be able to reach him. Erecto didn't even understand what happened and how Yuan managed to attack him. But it wasn't just a punch to the face. There was something special about it. Before striking, Yuan imbued his sword with wave energy, and it seemed that Erecto's stone body was excellent at conducting such energy. Erecto was amazed at how strong Yuan actually was, but he didn't want to admit it, and continued to babble on about how this young man dared to damage his body. To this, Yuan simply replied that he'd better stop chatting and start fighting. And if he'd already had enough of one blow, he might as well finish it. These words made Erecto lose his temper, and in anger, he tried to hit Yuan, but he dodged again. Erecto's emotions got the better of him. He was no longer able to control himself with anger, and he hated the look he imagined from some underworld upstart looking down on him. Then he used his technique, which greatly increased the force of his hand strike. He hit the ground with all his might, trying to hit the young man. Yuan couldn't understand why Erecto was acting so stupidly. He'd already pulled off a similar attack. Wasn't he willing to try something different? But Erecto was so angry that he didn't care. He just wanted to kill the boy. Erecto continued to chase him around the arena, trying to land at least one blow. However, Yuan's speed was a level higher. And yet, if he continued to attack the same way without taking any countermeasures, all Yuan could do was counterattack. In other words, he had no choice but to counter Erecto in the same manner. His blow was much more powerful and painful than the previous one. It seemed that he injured his opponent's arm. Zeno also watched this fight, but the match seemed pointless to him. Meanwhile, the commentators' opinions changed dramatically. No one could believe that Erecto was so easily inferior in strength to Yuan. Compared to how Yuan was when he first entered, he has become much stronger now. The ardent haters couldn't believe their eyes. Was Erecto really that weak? They even began to think that the video on the Vostani channel was actually real, and not just a good edit. The professor was also perplexed. Just a week ago, the boy was no match for him, and now he looked like a real warrior. How did the young man manage to achieve this in just a few days? At that moment, he received an urgent message directly from the professor's meeting. Yuan didn't know what to do. Attacking someone who couldn't even move due to injuries would look pathetic. If Erecto wants to continue the fight, he needs to get up or he will lose. But the professor declared the sparring over by the observer's decision, without a winner, as Erecto was deemed unfit to continue the fight. This provoked a strong reaction from everyone. The professor added that, for the protection of both participants, the sparring was being terminated. Yuan didn't want to accept this outcome. He was certain that if he had been beaten, the professor would have continued the fight until he died. So the young man wanted to clarify something, but the professor simply replied that objections were not allowed. He also demanded that Yuan leave the circle, which he did not agree with. However, the young man still retreated. But it seemed strange to him that the fight ended in such a way without allowing the winner to be determined. Even though the situation was unpleasant, Yuan didn't look like a loser, which means we can assume that the victory was his. But suddenly Yuan heard the professor's screams as he tried to stop Erecto. Despite the fight being over and being deemed unable to continue, Erecto still rose to continue the fight. He felt it was unacceptable to kneel before someone like Yuan, and didn't want to end up with his own shame. A huge boulder rushed towards Yuan, completely ignoring the professor's words. He realized that it would be impossible to stop Erecto and asked Yuan to dodge. But Yuan had a different opinion. Why dodge if you can give a worthy rebuff? Moreover, Erecto seriously intends to kill him. So why can't he respond in kind? He heard the professor's order to stop, but he probably thought that since Yuan was from the lower dimension, he could be ignored. And the teachers who themselves encouraged the fight and then stopped it on a whim, Yuan wanted to answer everyone at once. The Academy's methods were beginning to seriously irritate him. With a powerful blow, Yuan cut off Erecto's right arm. The pain was so intense that it seemed that Erecto's scream could be heard beyond the Academy's dimension. The spectators were shocked by what they saw. This usually doesn't happen in sparring. The professor pleaded with Erecto to calm down, saying that his arm could be restored, while a message window appeared on Yuan's screen. He was faced with a choice. Take the concepts from the severed hand or stop. Yuan hadn't expected such a thing to be possible. Meanwhile, the professor was hastily trying to send Erecto to the medical center and ordered him not to move. After that, he began to scold Yuan for not dodging even though he was clearly told to. Yuan apologized, explaining that everything happened too suddenly and he couldn't react differently. The professor flew into a rage, not considering such words remorseful. At that moment, the Academy's vice-rector intervened. Zeno asked Professor Farrell to calm down and let him sort out the situation himself. He introduced himself to Yuan as the vice principal of the Academy and said that they had seen everything. From now on, he would start asking questions, so Yuan had to answer honestly. He couldn't refuse. Zeno asked about Erecto's reckless attack. After all, the young man would not claim that he could not dodge. With his abilities, he could easily have avoided the blow. The vice-rector added that due to the difference in their strength, he and the professors decided to end the fight. Now they wanted to hear from Yuan an explanation for what he had done. The professor wondered why he didn't dodge the attack. Yuan remembered that he had recently gained the ability to use the power of words, but he had never really thought about what it meant. But despite this, the question coming from the screen made him feel uneasy. Even from here, Yuan felt a tremendous pressure and couldn't imagine who the vice principal really was. Yet he dared to reply that he had not dodged Erecto's attack and had instead counterattacked on a whim. He simply believed that a student who disregarded a professor's authority and acted as he pleased should suffer the consequences. The vice-rector asked again whether he had misheard what Yuan had said about the authority of professors. The young man added that, in addition, in an official sparring match, where the rules must be strictly observed, he wanted to make sure that no one else would break them. Zeno asked why he thought so. Yuan replied that many students and spectators from other dimensions were watching the sparring. Despite this, Erecto ignored the announcement of the end of the fight and attempted to kill him. He noted that if he had reacted passively, it might have shown that rules could be relaxed when dealing with a student from the underworld. Since there was little time to think, he considers his actions justified, and he acted exclusively in accordance with the principles of the academy. Zenon noted how resourceful Yuan was responding, fully aware that many people were currently watching their conversation. He had transferred the problem between the two people to the entire academy, and the situation could no longer be ignored. However, there was one more thing. Zenon admitted that Yuan's words were true. Students who disregard the rules of sparring deserve appropriate punishment. But still, punishing students for their misdeeds is the job of the academy and the teachers, and not the job of people like him. It turns out that Yuan lost this verbal battle, but he was not going to back down. Professor Farrell believed that it didn't matter what nonsense Yuan talked, because his opponent was the vice-chancellor himself. Yuan agreed that if his actions had undermined the professor's authority, he offered his deepest apologies. The young man added that in any case, he was ready to be punished for what he had done. But the vice-rector simply replied that everything was fine, and that he was not going to discuss the punishment. This surprised both Yuan and Professor Farrell. Zenon added that he was simply curious about what the young man was thinking when he acted like that. And with this, he demonstrated that Yuan had the determination and eloquence to win the constellation's favor. Ultimately, he declared that the blame lay with Erecto, who ignored the end of the match and attacked. Therefore, Zeno and other professors considered the student's self-defense to be justified. Professor Farrell tried to object to the vice-chancellor, but he ordered him to stop his disgraceful behavior. After all, if he had stopped the enraged Erecto in time, nothing would have happened. Therefore, he too will bear responsibility. Finally, the vice-rector added that reattaching Erecto's arm wasn't such a difficult task, so the sparring could end there. Among the students, of course, there were those who did not want to accept such an outcome. Yuan's friends, on the contrary, were glad that everything ended peacefully. The vice-rector asked the students to return to their seats and focus on their studies. He also noted that Yuan had done well and could also leave. At the end, Zenon said they would meet again. This alarmed Yuan, as he didn't understand what he meant. Returning to his friends, he thanked them for their support. They discussed sparring together. Eslight remarked that the boss fights in the tower had clearly benefited Yuan. Dakoyan also admitted that she enjoyed watching the duel. Yuan became stronger. She was interested in how his new power felt and how useful it was. Yuan joked that it was all thanks to his secret training with her. But Dakoyan meant something else. The girl spoke of Erecto's hand, which he cut off and absorbed. Yuan tensed up a little when she brought it up, but he honestly admitted that yes. At the moment when he cut off his hand, he did not think about the consequences. And I didn't even imagine that I could get new concepts in this way. Just in case, he took a little bit and opened two concepts, Giant and Vulcan, which people cannot possess. And it really worked, because before he couldn't control the concepts of living beings at will. And now it looks like it will be able to absorb specific parts, cutting them off. In this way, he managed to absorb Erecto's right arm. Dakoyan didn't understand why Yuan was talking about it with a gloomy expression, even though everything turned out well. He explained that at first he was delighted with his new power, but when he came to his senses, he realized that he had cut off the hand of a man, not a monster. And remembering the joy of the acquired power, he felt strange and uncomfortable. Dakoyan simply waved her hand, saying that he was talking nonsense and advised him to keep his head up. After all, Erecto tried to kill him, so the retribution of losing his arm is more than fair. He won, Erecto lost, and that was it. Her words pleasantly surprised Yuan. Dakoyan added that it doesn't matter who his opponents are. If someone attempts on your life, their fate is already sealed. Her words brought Yuan back to reality, and he apologized to his friends for his dark thoughts. Worrying about such things was truly foolish. Dakoyan smiled and remarked what would happen if she went through the special classroom and cut off their hands. These words immediately frightened Yuan. Eslight hastened to reassure his friend, saying that, unlike Doc Goyon, he was still human. Doc Goyon didn't appreciate the joke, and it seemed a new quarrel was brewing between her and S-Light. At that moment, Yuan received a strange letter. His reaction was so violent that his friends began to worry about him. It turned out to be Zeno's obligatory lecture with no right to refuse. Professor Zenin's supplementary course, Constellations of Babylon, is only for seniors, fourth-year students, and above. In it, he explains how to properly attract the support of the constellations and conduct negotiations. He also shares other useful knowledge and explains how to avoid the wrath of the constellations and make a smooth transition from one to another. On the way to the classroom, they heard other students whispering behind their backs. Yuan was called a salesman who talked a lot and had an air of superiority. The older students were surprised at what 11th grade students were doing here. After all, this place is only for seniors. As they walked towards the auditorium, Yuan wanted to say something. He noted that there was a rumor in their world. The more often you were cursed, the longer you lived. Dakoyun joked that in that case, Yuan was destined for immortality. Russell was worried about him after yesterday, fearing that now even more people would hate him. After all, everyone judges by rumors, without even knowing who he really is. But Yuan assured her that everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about. He thanked her for her concern, but added that she shouldn't worry about it. Doc Goyon suspected something was wrong. After their weekend outing, Russell and Yuan seemed to be on the same wavelength. She suggested that perhaps it had something to do with the gifts he'd given her, and if she was going to court him, she should do it elsewhere. Russell answered without hesitation that perhaps it was just jealousy. These words touched Doc Goyon, and she was about to use force. But now was no time for quarrels. They had approached the audience, and it was time to go in. S-Light warned Yuan that there had already been a similar lecture last week, and it was unknown how the seniors would react if newcomers from the lower dimension suddenly appeared. Yuan was also a little worried, but tried to remain optimistic. He hoped the older students would think that promising younger students had joined them. But his hopes were not fulfilled. Few of the elders were happy about their appearance. These seniors were so different from the other students that even Dagoyan couldn't ignore their strength. Just one look from them put a lot of pressure on them. Even Yuan couldn't help but activate his eyes to find out more about them. Professor Zeno greeted the junior students and was glad to see them at his lecture. As expected, the lecture hall was a place for gifted students, but not to that extent. Yuan couldn't read a single concept. They were all beyond his understanding. The professor began the lecture and introduced the children to the subject, explaining that the purpose of this lecture was simple: to understand the origin of the tower and the constellations. Since they are joined by younger students today, they will first talk about the tower. At first glance, the tower looks like a huge structure without beginning or end, but in reality it is indistinguishable from a living organism. As they climb the tower, they overcome challenges and discover hidden treasures and secrets within. It looks like they earn rewards by clearing rooms, but it's not that simple. They don't find the rewards. The tower has prepared them for them to reach, to select the most outstanding conquerors among them. With the finest items, exceptional treasures, and thanks to an incredible miracle, the tower itself seeks out those who seek to know and understand themselves. It is best to reveal secrets to those who are capable of understanding them. This is the basic condition for any intelligent being predisposed to a higher level of thinking. Yuan had already accumulated enough questions in such a short period of time. Zenin's lecture seemed pointless to him. Just one intruder had turned the tower system upside down. How can she be alive and thinking if she chooses her conquerors herself? This seemed too strange to the young man. However, if you think about it, the moment when the rector's letter was sent out en masse happened shortly after the attacker entered the tower. Therefore, they assumed that the spider swarm phenomenon in the fourth room was caused by an uninvited guest. But if you think about it, something odd was already noticeable from the very first room. The thing that instantly killed Russell was clearly elite. If the tower only started acting strange after they reached that room, then the difficulty of the first, second, and third remains inexplicable. Yuan couldn't understand what was really going on. The professor said that the tower is actually indistinguishable from a living organism, and this may serve as a wild guess. But what if we change the conditions? It's safe to assume the difficulty hasn't changed because of the intruder. It changed because they began to ascend. The difficulties from the very beginning were caused by the tower's independent thinking, and perhaps that's why it placed them there. Or maybe it was because Yuan, the descendant of the tower's master, had begun his ascent. These thoughts turned everything upside down in Yuan's head. He no longer understood where the truth was and where the lie was. Watching him, Professor Zeno also noticed something strange about the young man. Yuan continued to think. If the tower thinks and chooses climbers as the professor said, then there will never be a better moment. After all, their class faces challenges and situations that are unlike any other. As has been said, high risk comes with high reward. The rewards the tower has in store are destined to be on a whole new level. Yuan was also worried that he still hadn't been able to master the concepts taught in the classroom. And suddenly Zeno asked him if he'd managed to master it, the concept of a barrier around. He noted that some students don't notice it even after years, but discovering this sphere on the very first day was quite remarkable. Zenon praised Yuan for his intuition. Zeno also added that, as expected, as first years, they fully meet the requirements needed to take this lecture. In this regard, the professor had one small question for Yuan. Zeno asked the young man what he saw in this sphere, but Yuan couldn't see anything. Everything seemed unknown and beyond his comprehension. So he honestly answered the professor that he didn't see anything. Zeno asked him to concentrate a little better and try again. But nothing was working. The professor continued to insist that he try to concentrate again. He had to see something in this sphere to unlock its secret. And suddenly, Yuan managed to see something he had already encountered before. Inside the sphere, he saw the concepts of barrier, gap, and protection. But unfortunately, for now, it all looked like he couldn't absorb it. The professor thanked him and told him to stop and rest a little. Zeno was not mistaken. The young man was truly unusual. He had just managed to unlock the three main abilities of the sphere. Now it became clear to Zenon why the rector was keeping such an eye on Yuan. The professor asked Yuan if he understood what this sphere was. Yuan answered honestly that he didn't understand anything yet. Zenon acknowledged his honesty but suggested it would be better if he thought about it a little more. The professor wanted to emphasize to everyone, both in the classroom and in everyday life, the power of thought and the development of imagination are important, because the expansion of thought is directly related to increased strength. Therefore, if students want to use their skills at a more advanced level, they need to develop the power of thought, their driving force. Yuan didn't quite understand what was going on and asked the professor if someone with high cognitive abilities could really control the sphere. Zeno replied that everything was correct. That's why it's so important to develop your thinking. Even if the answer doesn't come right away, you can't stop thinking. Once you understand the structure of all things, analyze them, and learn to think big. This sphere can turn a person into a kind of pseudo-god. But Yuan still didn't fully understand what exactly the professor was talking about. Zenon noted that this may be difficult to understand now, but that understanding will come naturally as the lectures progress. This is the core material of his course, also related to the main lecture, simulating the War of the Constellations. At this point, today's lecture ended, and as an assignment, the professor asked them to imagine possible uses for the sphere. And yet, Yuan found it difficult to understand all this, despite the professor's explanations. If this is God, then what is a pseudo-god? A being resembling God? Or a false god? These thoughts haunted the young man. Eslight suggested the boys return to the dorm, but Yuan continued to ponder the principle of becoming a god. Perhaps it was difficult to understand because they were freshmen and the lecture was too difficult. On the way back, Yuan asked the boys if anyone could explain the lecture material again. Eslight was surprised to hear him say so, as he'd expected Yuan to summarize it for the others. Suddenly they encountered Ordema, the very same rival of Dokoyan. Yuan asked him what he was doing there, but the proud Ordema only wanted to know where Dokoyan was. The guys didn't quite understand what he was talking about and why he suddenly needed Dokoyan. She lagged behind them a little on the way and came up a little later, surprised to see that everyone was huddled together. Dokoyan thought something big had happened, but luckily it was just Ordema. As he himself said, he came to her on special business. Dokoyan thought that he wanted to have another duel, a so-called rematch. She told him that if that was the case, then if he wanted to die, she would not stop him. However, this was not a desire for a duel. Ordema had completely different intentions. Ordema came here to ask her out on a date. The boys were surprised to see the ruler of the dimension inviting Dokoyan for a walk. Yuan didn't understand what kind of person you had to be to fall in love with a woman who beat you half to death. Eslight noticed that Yuan had answered his own question, hinting at it. But Dokoyan believed that Ordema was simply plotting some kind of plan against her. The boys were surprised to hear this, because it didn't sound like a sinister plan at all. Dokoyan was sure he had an ulterior motive. There was no trace of affection in his gaze. Yuan countered that that wasn't the case at all. Maybe it was because she was beautiful. Yuan didn't understand how Yuan could say such embarrassing things so casually. At this point, Russell began to think, what if there really wasn't any catch there? After all, at that moment, Ortema didn't look like he was planning anything bad. He seemed sincere at the time, but Yuan thought he was up to something and replied that she wasn't interested in him. At that moment, Ortema really looked depressed. It seemed that this was not the answer he expected to hear from her. Meanwhile, the guys continued training. Yuan discovered new concepts, charm and honor, after uploading them to his channel. His charm allowed him to enchant and influence others. However, he still didn't understand how this would help him advance through the tower. Yuan asked Russell if his face had changed recently. She didn't quite understand what he meant and said she thought he looked very attractive. But that wasn't quite what he wanted to clarify. Hearing their conversation, Yuan became furious again. She reminded them that during training they should concentrate, and during rest periods they should rest, not fool around. Yuan asked Yuan if his face was okay, but she told him to focus on training and not do stupid things. Yuan continued to train with Russell, helping her control her power. With such training, he wanted to establish her control over the animal part. S-Light noted that Yuan had indeed gotten stronger, and suggested that perhaps they should stop focusing on dungeons and move on. But Yuan replied that although he had become stronger, he was still far behind her and Russell. Their training together was only successful because each of them acted gently towards the other. In any case, tomorrow they were planning to head out to the tower again. Yuan was interested in whether Yuan had managed to figure out what to do with Russell, since the pace of the expedition was no different from last week. If they fail to find a solution quickly, they will face the same thing again as last time. Over the past week, while observing Russell, Yuan noticed several things. Her heart was driving her crazy, and any emotion became fuel for her. Her state changed dramatically depending on what emotion fueled her. If negative emotions served as food, she burned more and more intensely and lost control of herself. And when it was nourished by calm and positive feelings, the riot subsided and the emotions stabilized. In combat, strong emotions inevitably intensify, making a state of rage almost inevitable. But if Yuan can change the fuel to something positive, it might work. And now he needed to test this theory in practice. He finally managed to calm Russell down, at least for a while, and stop her continuous attacks. All last week he had not been having fun, but trying to find a way to help her. Spending time with her, he collected her emotions when she was happy, having fun, or feeling calm. These were not artificially created feelings, but copies of her own emotions. Now Yuan intended to use them as fuel for Russell, hoping that it would help. At least that's what he hoped for and believed it would work. But the theory turned out to be much simpler than the practice, and Yuan failed to make Russell absorb the positive emotions. On the contrary, she became even more aggressive and counterattacked him. Having knocked him to the ground without much effort, she became more and more furious, like a wild animal. Yuan and S-Light rushed to his aid, and at that moment, Yuan used Eva to grab Russell with chains. It was a miracle he survived, but who knows what could have happened if he had thought for a second. However, Yuan noticed that Russell seemed to have returned to normal faster than they could have chained her up. It turns out that there was progress, and that was encouraging, but waiting for it every time was too dangerous. There were definitely changes, but exactly what they were was still unclear. Russell thanked Yuan, although he wasn't entirely sure why. He replied that it was too early to thank them, since they hadn't completely solved the problem. But she said she could now fight with peace of mind. It was a big step for her and she was glad that Yuan was there, but their conversation was interrupted by Yuan again. Yuan, as always, was tensed when he saw her so close. But everyone was glad that no one was seriously hurt. However, Yuan noticed some strange change in Russell. For some reason, she decided to remain silent, only saying that training was over for today. Russell was alarmed by the fact that Yuan seemed to want to say something, but changed her mind. The next day, they went to the tower, and S-Light wondered why he couldn't take the sword with him. Yuan explained that they had agreed to build a solid foundation without rushing things. After all, this was only their second study in the first semester, so S-Light shouldn't worry. But he was still worried, and Yuan noted that the more he used the holy sword, the more it depended on him. The concept of a demon combined with a holy spirit no longer gave Yuan the confidence that it was truly a holy sword. Therefore, it was better to keep S-Light away if this weapon had a negative effect on him. S-Light said that if he fell through the tower because of this, he wouldn't be blamed. Yuan replied that they wouldn't blame him. they'd just make him suffer even more. Before the trip, Yuan decided to review his characteristics once again. Compared to what he had before, he has now become several times stronger. He also prepared Eva and Taiki, living artifacts that were integral parts of his power. Before the trip, Russell told Yuan that she would do her best not to lose control and would listen carefully to everything he said. Yuan pointed out that he was indeed strong in a real fight, and Russell naturally believed him. Doc Goyon wanted to clarify a few things with him before they left. She reminded him that the first assessment would take place today, and frankly, she was disappointed with S-Light and Russell, unless he had forgotten the promise he made to her. Yuan replied that he remembered and added that they had both already begun to change, so there was no need to expect immediate results. Everything would be as he said. However, Doc Goyon was worried about Russell, especially about what she was going to say yesterday. Russell tried to eavesdrop on their conversation discreetly, but Doc Goyon noticed it without any difficulty. She used some technique to muffle Russell's hearing. A strange ringing sound began in Russell's ears that only she could hear. Doc Goyon asked Yuan if he knew what submissiveness was. He replied that it was being dominated. She countered that this was not entirely true. From the perspective of the one being dominated, it might feel uncomfortable, but some people find stability in strong, firm leadership. In this sense, according to her, Russell really likes someone who is able to completely control and subjugate her. Yuan didn't quite understand where Doc Goyon was going with this, so she decided to speak frankly. When the beast becomes uncontrollable, empty talk is useless. But even so, Yuan still didn't understand what she was talking about, and this irritated Doc Goyon quite a bit. She said that if he didn't understand, then at least let him remember her words. The boys had no time to think. Right now, they had to try to conquer the tower again. Yuan called this the second sortie of the special selection freshmen and told everyone to get ready. The new room was very different from the previous ones, not only in appearance but also in terms of pressure. If before the rooms resembled caves, now everything looked like another planet with a view of space. Doc Goyon was even a little confused, deciding that they would start from the first room. However, this place did not look like a starting area at all. A labyrinth awaited them. Yuan noted that, judging by the pendant, they were currently on the 5th floor. And yet, despite the fact that it was only the 5th floor with a labyrinth, the oddities did not end there. Yuan noticed how Russell started to act strangely. She walked to the side, ignoring the others. Russell claimed to sense a monster nearby and asked Yuan to catch it. He was surprised that instead of finding a way, she found the monster first. Suddenly, Yuan noticed something too. But it didn't look like a monster. It looked more like a system glitch. Perhaps their last attempt was starting to repeat itself, they thought. S-Light assumed it looked like a secret passage like the one on the 1st floor, but Yuan said it was something else. It sounded like it was about to break, like it was about to crack. And at that moment, Russell lunged at what she thought was a monster. Without thinking, she hit it, and the unknown object disappeared. Then a window with a code appeared in front of Yuan, which said that he had opened an unknown glitch that had new concepts of malfunction and inversion. As the young man expected, it was a glitch phenomenon. When the signal is disrupted, both the image and sound are distorted, and inversion adds a suspense effect at the moment the monster appears. Since this type was completely unlike any monster he'd encountered before, completely unfamiliar concepts were at play. Yuan tried to understand how malfunction and inversion interacted with each other, and while he was deep in thought, one of the monsters attacked him. Fortunately, Doc Goyon managed to react in time and destroyed the threat. She reminded us that we need to be more attentive and keep moving. The path is difficult and we can't stand still. Doc Goyon also added that it was a mental-type monster, which usually doesn't appear on the 5th floor. But under these circumstances, nothing surprises her anymore. While they were running, Yuan continued to build up his inversion. Perhaps it would come in handy. Meanwhile, Russell also continued to fight the monsters. Although she could still control herself, for some reason she couldn't stop. Yuan said that she shouldn't fight alone, otherwise she would risk going berserk. Therefore, he noted that for now, it would be better for her to stay close to him. Doc Goyon continued to remind everyone to be alert and not get distracted by conversations. Yuan decided not to try to absorb the concepts emerging from the walls of the labyrinth for now, putting it off until later. Right now, he needed to focus on absorbing concepts from the glitches. Quite a lot of time had passed, but they continued to move along the route, as if in a circle. Doc Goyon noted that it was indeed strange. She remembered every route she had taken, but despite the changed shape of the passages, This place seemed familiar. The thing was that this was not an ordinary labyrinth, but one that changed in real time. Therefore, according to Doc Goyen, the only way is to destroy the labyrinth entirely. Her words gave Yuan an interesting thought. The thing is, he was so caught up in collecting inversion that he missed something important. Just when Doc Goyen was about to destroy the labyrinth, Yuan asked her to wait a bit. He explained that a constantly changing path made no sense, meaning there had to be a hidden exit somewhere. Perhaps some kind of camouflaged door right in the wall. His guesses turned out to be correct. The young man found a key hidden in the wall. Thanks to this, he absorbed the concept of illusion, which is inaccessible to ordinary people. The other side of the labyrinth opened up before them, another part of the room. The boys were surprised how Yuan had managed to discover this. He admitted that he'd noticed the place a long time ago, but had been too focused on collecting concepts and had ignored the discovery. However, Yuan explained to his friends that he didn't like wasting time either, so after observing what was happening for a couple of hours, he found an area that seemed strange to him. This gave Dakoyan a thought. Yuan had managed to find a magical vulnerability that even she hadn't noticed. As she suspected, Yuan is more than just a genius. He's far beyond that. Meanwhile, the group continued to move through the labyrinth, destroying magical vulnerabilities. This also paid off for Yuan, as he continued to accumulate more and more valuable concepts. But there was one problem. The young man had hit the ceiling. His magical power had reached 199,999 and was not increasing any further. Even though Yuan had absorbed enough concepts, even more than necessary, his magical power still did not grow, unlike his life or body. Suddenly, Dakoyan crept up to him unnoticed. The young man was so immersed in his thoughts that he didn't notice her. She asked what was bothering him, and he replied that despite defeating an elite monster, his magic power was not increasing. Hearing this, Dakoyan laughed slightly, but Yuan didn't share her amusement. She explained that it was all because he had hit a wall. He absorbed energy, as if sucking it out of everything around him, but he continued to water the plant, not giving it time to grow, which is why he quickly reached his limit. So trying to surpass the limit by blindly hunting monsters right now isn't the best option. She noted that there is a more effective and efficient method that can help him. At that moment, she looked at Russell with suspicion, which scared her a little. Dakoyan said that instead of hanging around campus on weekends, it was better to breathe fresh air, eat delicious food, and go shopping, hinting that while she and Yuan were having fun, she continued studying. But Yuan asked her to tell him about this method, promising in exchange to consider going out to eat or shopping with her. Dakoyan agreed, noting that it would take time. The best thing he could do now was learn the basics of the divine manifestation art, Hyunsingon. Despite its grand name, this is just a basic martial art and won't be too difficult. Until now, Yuan had only studied principles from Dakoyan, but had never directly practiced martial arts. Could this be the beginning of real training? Yuan asked if he shouldn't at least go through a formal apprenticeship ceremony or something. Dakoyan replied that this was just basic internal training that even children learned, so it was better for them to prepare. She was surprised by Yuan's words. After all, he was a person from another world, but he was talking about a formal apprenticeship ceremony. She pretended that it didn't mean anything, although in fact, the art of divine manifestation is not a martial art that can be taught simply at will. It's a secret technique, strictly passed down through generations, and if her father knew about it, he would be quite shocked. After all, they met only recently. He is a stranger from another world, and she is already passing on the family technology to him. Yuan was already ready, but he didn't understand why he needed to undress. Dakoyan herself couldn't imagine that she would one day pass on a secret art intended only for the descendants of her family to someone like Yuan. So if she ever told anyone about it, it would only be when he became her husband. But since she'd already agreed, she had to see it through. Dakoyan told Yuan to sit up straight and calm his mind. From the moment they met, she had a strange feeling growing in her, a desire to raise this person with her own hands. Yuan was different from anyone she had met before. His talent in martial arts was undeniable, but his potential was even more impressive. If such a person develops systematically, it will be interesting to see how quickly and far he can advance. These thoughts haunted Dakoyan, and at the same time, she didn't want anyone other than her to influence his potential. She herself did not understand what it was about him that made her experience such feelings, but now was not the time to be distracted by such thoughts. She asked Yuan again if he was ready. Yuan asked if before starting, shouldn't Dakoyan recite a mantra or some kind of introductory speech? explain the technique, its name, essence, and application. This made Dokoyan laugh. She replied that even if he read it, he would hardly understand. It would be easier to implant it into his body right away. But regarding the apprenticeship ceremony, she became curious about where Yuan got such knowledge of martial arts. But Yuan refrained from answering. After all, if he'd said he'd read too many martial arts novels, Dakoyan would have definitely beaten him up. She warned that she was starting the process. Yuan wanted to say something, but it was too late. The divine manifestation technique that Dakoyan was going to teach him would completely change the nature of his chi, mana, and body. The body will constantly absorb magical power, creating pure chi. And since the body and mana are trained simultaneously, their capacity will naturally increase. Roughly speaking, you filter magical power and transform it into pure chi. When Dakoyan touched Yuan, it felt like a fireball had burst into him. It felt like it was madly devouring mana and moving throughout my entire body. It was as if he was paving a path where none had existed before. Yuan began to worry that his body would burn out from all this energy. But Dakoyan told him to calm down, explaining that burning one's way inside the body, constantly moving divine chi, is the basis of divine manifestation. Once he completes his training, the further path will open up to him. Blue flames continuously moved inside Yuan's body. Over time, he began to feel much better, and realized that using mana directly was not always the best choice. He also acquired a new martial arts concept, divine manifestation, and reached the 20th level of comprehension. This eliminated some negative concepts in his body, while the excess positive potential accelerated the development of others. As Dakoyan had said, the concepts in his body were gradually replaced by divine chi. The more he trained, the more he felt himself growing. Yuan thanked Dakoyan and asked what gift she wanted in return. She replied with a smile that she was looking forward to it and would definitely think about it. In the meantime, he better wipe off the sweat if he doesn't want to conquer the tower alone. Yuan felt a strange feeling. If he concentrated a little harder, he might be able to sense the circulation of divine chi. The more filtered chi passed through the body, the stronger the body became and the sharper the senses. Yuan never imagined that such an effective martial art would be given to him so easily. Eslight asked if he was going to upload a video of the process, but Yuan replied that of course not. Dakoyan asked why, which made Yuan a little nervous. The guys started joking that such a video would get a ton of views, but Yuan just said that something like that would definitely not happen on their channel. Eslight offered his friends a snack, as they had been wandering around the floor for quite some time, but Dakoyan replied that she was against it. They had already lingered on the 5th floor for too long, so they could forget about food until they got to the 6th. And suddenly they managed to see something that looked like an exit. It was a huge door. Perhaps the entrance to the next room was hidden behind it. Eslight suggested that the road to the 6th level should be behind this door, but Yuan had his doubts. He asked his friends not to rush into a decision and give him a second to think. Yuan felt like something strange was going on and that there was something wrong with this door. Using his eyes, he noticed the dim traces of another concept. Yuan didn't immediately understand where they were leading, inside the door or outside it. Although the situation was tense, Yuan became curious and stepped forward first. He didn't explain anything to the others, so they decided to follow him. At first glance, there was nothing behind the door. It looked like just a wall. Eslight suggested that perhaps they had gone the wrong way. At first, that was what it seemed like. But if you looked more closely, you could see something. With his eyes, Yuan noticed many concepts on the wall. The wall was densely filled with illusions. Yuan decided to touch the illusions. Perhaps something would happen. And so it happened. He destroyed the concepts of illusion and opened a new passage. The guys were surprised and didn't understand what it was, but it was obvious this was a new exit. Dakoyan noted that this appears to be a shortcut. Having shattered the wall of illusions, Yuan absorbed 50 concepts. This was incredible, as he had previously only collected 0.1 each. He was glad that he had managed to find such a well-hidden secret path. Yuan asked the others what they would do now that they had found the shortest route. Perhaps the shortcut is actually more dangerous than the usual one. But the boys cast aside their doubts and ran towards the new path at once. Yuan decided to feed 50 illusion concepts to Eva to make her even stronger. The shortest route didn't resemble a normal road. It was a long staircase leading straight up. Yuan suggested that perhaps the room was shifting as they ascended, but there was no distinct shift. Dakoyan suggested that perhaps the staircase was the shift. Russell noted that Coulomb indicated that they were now on the 8th floor. Yuan was surprised that the route was so short. They managed to skip 3 rooms at once. Light remembered what the guidebook said about this. A shortcut was a great success, but the more rooms they passed, the more difficult the one they ended up in would be, although the reward for it was higher. However, Light still remained worried and asked that next time they avoid shortcuts. Yuan couldn't understand why he was so scared. This hadn't happened last time. Moreover, he seemed less stable, constantly thinking about his sword. Goyen continued to chide Light for relying too much on his sword. Perhaps it would have been better if she had broken it. At that moment, Yuan and Russell seemed to have found a way out. At the end of the climb, there was something that looked like a door. Could it be that they had finally reached the exit? Since the pendant showed the 8th level, the 9th should be waiting for them behind this door. Russell advised Yuan to be careful after sensing hostility outside the door. It was just like that time when she had the feeling of a monster's presence. Goyen agreed that caution wouldn't hurt, adding that when they got up, Light could draw her sword. Light was so happy about this that without a second thought he rushed to be the first to look at the next floor. This floor was again different from those they had visited. There were no monsters or high ceilings here. Light assumed they had entered a recreation area. But Yuan doubted it. There was no mention of a rest area anywhere. Meanwhile, a stranger was hiding behind one of the columns. He suddenly used his power and fired straight at the group. A flying ball, similar to a bullet bomb, headed towards Goyen. Goyen was surprised to see this, not immediately understanding what had happened. There was a powerful explosion. The boys were worried if she was okay. Goyen managed to stop the attack and asked Yuan what it was, as it had been said before that no one but him could use the weapons in the tower. Yuan suggested that the enemy's weapon might be disposable. Using his eyes, he easily found the enemy, who then attacked them from behind. He ordered Light to run after the attacker and catch him. The stranger did not immediately understand that he had been identified and how Yuan had found his hiding place. He was certain his stealth skills shouldn't be judged by novices. But at that moment, Light pierced him with his sword. It confused him, but he still hoped that the situation was under control. Initially, he wanted to remove Light and then destroy the entire group. Yuan asked if Goyen was okay, noting that if the shot had hit someone else, it could have been dangerous. He also noticed that this was no ordinary projectile. Right now, Goyen had her foot on a magic bomb, a very powerful one at that, but Yuan managed to defuse it. Meanwhile, the battle between Light and the unknown enemy continued. Light struck, not giving the enemy a chance to counterattack. While he was off guard, Yuan threw his own bomb at him. When the stranger reached for the detonation button, everything turned against him. He was shocked to see his own bomb right above his head. He expected an explosion, but was very surprised when the bomb did not explode after bouncing off the column. But one way or another, he no longer had time to be surprised. After all, despite this, his main opponent was still Light. And for his loss of vigilance, he paid with his life. Light asked why he attacked them and how he ended up here. Yuan also approached them and asked if, even after he had identified him, he still hadn't realized that he had bombs in his shells. The enemy relied too much on his skills and ended up getting caught. But the stranger did not answer, but on the contrary began to ask them who they were. He was also curious about what a strong rookie like Yuan was doing on the lower floors. After his sharp outburst, a magic projectile from Goyen flew at him. He couldn't even imagine the trouble he was in, thinking that it would be easy to deal with them. Goyen said that before they could discuss everything peacefully, she would rather break his arms and legs so that he wouldn't do anything stupid. Meanwhile, anger at the stranger also gripped the seemingly calm Russell. Succumbing to negative emotions, she began to go into berserker mode and said that if they didn't kill this guy, he would kill them. She lunged at him without warning, but luckily, Yuan managed to stop her with his magic chains. But even so, Russell continued to be aggressive and ignore Yuan's words. Suddenly, a strange and frightening voice began to be heard from somewhere. The voice said that one of them had failed their mission, and apparently this voice was addressing the stranger. He continued that, given the situation, it looked like this guy's role had come to an end. He tried to argue that he could still be useful, but at that moment, something strange began to happen to his body. The voice continued to say that by sacrificing himself, he would earn the share of his comrades. It looked like the guy was about to explode, so Yuan ordered everyone to move away. The voice still spoke of sacrifice, despite the stranger's pleas for another chance. And at that moment, his body was compressed so tightly from the inside that it literally exploded. and the blast radius was quite large. The explosion resembled the detonation of a bomb, as if there really was something inside the guy. In the last seconds, Yuan managed to escape the powerful explosion. It even seemed to him that for a moment he saw a river of dead people, as if he was already there with one foot. If I hadn't had time to react, I would have truly become a part of it. Realizing that he couldn't dodge in time and was caught in the blast radius, Yuan decided to use the concept of a magic bomb. He was able to stop the explosion with another explosion, and if he had been even a second late, the consequences would have been catastrophic. S-Light was curious about what had happened to the guy. Yuan simply replied that he must be fine, and he returned to the first level of the tower. But suddenly the same mysterious voice spoke again, declaring that the boy was already dead, as the tower's will had interpreted his actions as a kill in combat. Essentially, it was the same as if they had killed him themselves. Yuan replied that this was nonsense, since it was this voice that pushed him to his death. The voice continued to talk about sacrifice, and how they had lost a valuable comrade without receiving anything in return. And now, they should be more careful, for the tower had begun to favor them. Yuan didn't understand what he was talking about and decided to ask him directly who he was, and also who that guy really was and why he tried to kill them. An unfamiliar voice replied that they were Exodus, adding that even though they were enemies, they would not mind meeting them again. The boys were surprised by the sudden turn of events in the tower. Russell noted that, unlike the previous constellation, this one at least gave its name. However, S-Light corrected them, saying it wasn't a name, but the name of an organization. S-Light added that Exodus is the most notorious pirate group in all dimensions. Most likely, some constellation patronizes them. The boys realized that these were the very pirates Professor Yumina had spoken of, and this worried them. Not only had they been greeted by a constellation, but now pirates were hunting them. Goyan noted that they were bound to encounter them anyway, so it was better to continue climbing higher and becoming stronger. But S-Light asked if they didn't find it strange that the constellation had just mentioned that the tower treated them specially. He noted that the constellation thus confirmed their suspicions about the tower. Surely no one felt strange. At that moment, S-Light, Russell, and Goyan received a notification. They looked at him strangely, so Yuan asked what was wrong. He was worried that it was another letter from the director, but Goyan replied that it was not quite so. It was a letter about leveling up and the corresponding rewards, and it came to everyone except Yuan. Goyan noted that this was her first level up since joining. Perhaps it happened after they survived the constellation's attack. S-Light was also surprised, but, unlike the joyful Goyan, it made him nervous and, to some extent, irritated. And Russell was simply happy that her stats had increased. Yuan was amazed because their stats were already off the charts, and now they had risen even higher. He couldn't understand why he was the only one left without a reward. Was it because he didn't have a status window? He refused to believe it, because he also wanted to receive his reward. Looking at the site of the explosion, Yuan noticed something strange, something that resembled a concept. But this concept looked different from those he had seen before. It looked more like a line of text, so Yuan decided he could absorb it. After all, since everyone received their awards, it means he has the right to. Having absorbed the concept, he felt a strange feeling, unlike any he had experienced before. His body began to change and his stats increased noticeably. Along with this, he discovered two new concepts: myriad forms and stigmata. Simply put, the myriad forms is the ultimate concept of transformation, and the stigmata is likely related to the constellations. Since he now had an improved form of transformation, Yuan decided to test it out. He asked Eva if she was okay with the concept, and she, of course, agreed. Besides, as Yuan noted, there is no point in holding on to concepts that he himself cannot use. However, as soon as Eva absorbed the concept, something strange began to happen to her, which greatly frightened Yuan. The other boys turned around at his cry and asked him what had happened. Turning around, they saw Yuan holding Eva, who had somehow transformed into an egg. She had acquired the form of a subject because she possessed a lower conceptual principle, which led to mutation. Yuan noted that something similar had happened before, but then she hatched immediately after the transformation. This time, no. Goyan suggested that perhaps she had also leveled up, but Yuan was still worried. But it seems they found an excellent way to calm Russell down if something happens. S-Light said the next room was the rest room and suggested they head there. Perhaps Eva would wake up by then. The lounge was significantly different from the others. It wasn't just an empty room, but something more. The famous 10th room, which many have only heard about. Eslight reminded that if the tower's conquerors were unlucky, there would be no food or water here. But it seems they were very lucky to stumble upon such a beautiful garden. The room revealed a garden where the trees bore fruits known as fruits of Eden. They relieved fatigue and increased stamina. Plus, they tasted absolutely amazing and incredibly sweet. Yuan remarked that he'd never tasted anything so delicious before. Doc Goyen agreed, adding that she'd never tasted anything so sweet either, and felt her energy increase slightly. She suggested eating all the fruit before moving on, but Eslight objected that it was pointless, since the effect only worked from one fruit. Yuan still wanted to find some way to take a couple of fruits with him, but he didn't yet understand how. Suddenly, a code window appeared in front of him, informing him that he had eaten the one and only fruit of Eden, the fruit of evil, and now his eyes were able to discern sins. Yuan didn't quite understand how he managed to get something like that just by eating a fruit that resembled a fig. And yet he became curious about the standards by which sin was defined here. Meanwhile, Russell called everyone over, asking them to look at the find. She had found something that resembled a chest. Doc Goyen guessed it was probably a reward for their success. Even though it seemed to be the lowest rank, there had to be something unique inside. Yuan agreed, adding that he felt like they had packed in all the challenges most teams would normally face into just one outing. He also recalled hearing about similar rewards. Each recreation area offers a treasure to mark the progress of the tower's climbers. They received a wooden chest with gold trim. It's likely low grade, but the contents are high quality. Yuan also noted that the treasures are enhanced if the chest is bronze, silver, or gold. Eslight was already eager to open the chest and see what was inside, but Doc Goyen stopped him. He didn't immediately understand why he couldn't open it, to which Doc Goyen explained that it was Yuan who had to open the chest. Doc Goyen replied that Eslight was the unluckiest of them all, a sentiment with which Russell agreed. However, Eslight himself wasn't particularly pleased with such remarks. Yuan himself was not averse to opening the chest, hoping that there would be something truly valuable inside. When they opened the chest, they experienced a wow effect, but alas, not in a good way. Inside lay an unknown object, resembling a scepter or a magic wand.